Chapter 364. As much as Lionel wanted to ignore everything else around him and focus on the monuments, there was only so long he could dodge Syl. Not long after Lionel found out the truth about the monuments and was planning on traveling through them one by one, the remaining 7 members of the Carefree family selections finally made it through the gates. Aside from the petite girl who had confronted Lionel initially, who became a royal, the rest were either generals or soldiers. With all of them now here, Lionel couldn't continue to stall Syl and had no choice but to follow her through the eastern sector and into the more luxurious regions. "Jirak, why are you following us?" Syl said, seemingly a bit displeased. Apparently, she still hadn't forgotten about the words Jirak had said to take advantage of her earlier. "Wherever Lionel goes, I go," Jirak said matter-of-factly. Lionel didn't refute this. If things went south, Jirak was maybe the only protection he had. He was under no delusions that he would be able to handle Syl's elder brother on his own. Unless Era had a way to contact her husband, it was unlikely that the Carefree family heir was even aware of Lionel's existence. And Lionel had a bad feeling that Era wanted it this way. Lionel wasn't oblivious. He knew of the underhanded tricks Era was pulling behind the scenes. One of the things he was best at was reading people. And he wasn't new to women being fond of him. As a 5-star quarterback, there were plenty of women, even those from noble families, who were willing to throw themselves at him. Even though the occupation wasn't as respected, that was only a matter of relativity. Not every woman would be able to find a husband from a 5-star profession of high standing. And, as a quarterback, Lionel was guaranteed to become a very rich man in the future. This was all to say that Lionel could easily read the signs of women coming on to him. It was just easier to pretend to be ignorant. But, by now, Lionel realized that if he allowed things to continue like this without stepping in properly, a small misunderstanding could easily become a massive one. The worst part was that he couldn't just step out and say he had feelings for another woman. He was quite familiar with women, and saying such a thing bluntly would only make him public enemy number 1. "Please come back soon." Lionel looked up into the sky, holding back crocodile tears. Things would be so much easier if Aina was here, even if she was still pretending to not like him. Lionel suddenly smiled. "That's all right, I know you've already fallen for me." Syl and Jirak looked toward Lionel's suddenly smiling face, wondering just what he was thinking about. At that moment, the surroundings began to change. From dirt roads and tents, they began to see neat little huts amid smooth roads. Soon, those smooth roads became paved in stone and the huts became small houses of brick. Even now, one couldn't say these homes were luxurious. They were quite minimalistic compared to true behemoths one might find in the outside world. However, in this place, where the only building taller than 3 stories was the massive tower that connected the sectors, this was by far the best place to live. Each home was gated and had a different style, exuding a different aura. Some reminded Lionel of gentle winds, others of rushing water, and still others like raging flames. However, what each house had in common was a single lamppost before its gate. It only took a moment for Lionel to understand that if this lamppost was lit, the house had been claimed. If it hadn't been, then the lamppost wouldn't be. Judging by the current situation, there were much more homes lit than Lionel thought there would be. Were there really this many emperors? Syl hesitated for a moment. Though she knew her brother would be here, she wasn't exactly sure where he would be. "You don't want to choose a house?" Jirak suddenly asked, glancing toward Lionel. "Not yet." Lionel shook his head. Jirak laughed. "If I was as weak as you, I'd be hesitant too." Lionel chuckled in response, not minding. How'd it feel to lose to someone so weak? Syl giggled, forgetting about her task to find her brother for a moment. Just as the group was about to continue through to see if they could find any clues, Lionel frowned. He turned back to find a young man strolling through the stone-paved roads. He wore white robes that shifted slightly with his every step. His long, black hair was neatly tied, making it almost impossible to make out individual strands. Everything about him exuded an air of refinement and cleanliness, almost like a diligently polished blade ready to be unsheathed. Sil noticed Lionel's odd reaction and turned back. Her eyes lit up in pleasant surprise. Big brother. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He hadn't expected to run into this man so easily. And, most importantly, he hadn't expected that even after overestimating his potential abilities in his mind, that Lionel would still be so surprised by the pressure he felt from this young man. As Lionel was looking toward the Carefree family heir, he too was looking toward Lionel. The young heir had never met Lionel before, he didn't know who he was either, but he still felt his eyes gravitate toward him. And, when he noticed the emperor mark that barely shrouded the black brand between his brows, he felt inwardly surprised. For a moment, he forgot to respond to his sister. A sword that hung to his back vibrated slightly, making it seem as though the blade might unsheath at any moment. This was the first time Lionel noticed the sword. His vision had been so focused on the young man before him. However, after a moment, he realized why he hadn't. The sword wasn't attached to anything. It floated in the air, following the young man around as though it couldn't bear to part with him. Lionel couldn't imagine the level of skill that was needed to reach such a state. Chapter 365. The atmosphere grew silent. Sil seemed to realize that something was wrong when she saw her brother and Lionel staring down one another. But, any word she wanted to speak seemed completely caught in her throat. She felt that she couldn't form the thing she wanted to say no matter how hard tried. Shing! 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 The sword to the young heir's back continued to tremble. Some unknown force held it back from unsheathing. Lionel continued to silently watch, sizing up the young man in white before him. Lionel knew too little about the fourth dimension to accurately gauge strength. But, he could sense pressure easier than maybe anyone else. Even though this young heir was weaker than Uncle Zimo, considering his youth, Lionel had no doubt that there would come a day when Zimo was completely overshadowed. Suddenly, the pressure dispersed. The young heir looked from Lionel to his little sister and smiled lightly. Though the smile was a bit cold, it was filled with a doting air to it. Sil, you're here. The young man nodded. And who is this? Sil shook her head to recover. Sister-in-law recommended him. He's participating as one of us. His name is Lionel Morales. Morales. The young man frowned. He felt something stir within him as his thoughts drifted toward a certain memory. But, he didn't remain in a trance for long. The universe was too big, those sharing the same name were far too numerous. Of course, those who were on the same level as certain families wouldn't dare to share the same name. For example, there was no way someone on terrain would take the Carefree family name. Such a person would be asking for death. However, there might very well be other fourth-dimensional worlds where the Carefree name was used. The influence of the Carefree family wasn't large enough to instill that kind of fear. This was all to say that it was a matter of perspective. And, to put this matter into perspective, the fact that this young heir even paused at this name meant that his scope was already far beyond those usually found on the fourth-dimensional plane. A higher dimensional world wouldn't care what ants beneath them did. But, the young heir knew that if by some miracle this Lionel Morales really made it to such a height, he would definitely have to change his name unless he wanted to be hunted down and executed. This matter was definitely not as rare as it seemed, and no small number of stubborn individuals had suffered. However, the young heir didn't bother to tell all of this to Lionel. Such a thing was far too distant in the future, and the likelihood that Lionel would ever reach such a level was slim to none. The young heir nodded. So Era decided this. The young heir was quite familiar with his wife, so he had a good idea of what she was thinking. But, taking care of someone in the third dimension, no matter how talented they were, would be difficult. Even he didn't dare to enter Brave City until he had grown to a certain level of strength. Is there a reason the Black City heir is here? Sil's elder brother asked. Jirak snorted. The only difference between me and you is that you're a bit older. Is there a need to stick your nose so high into the sky? Still, even the usually boisterous Jirak didn't dare to say these words aloud. Though this young heir seemed refined, anyone who had heard of history knew that he was a madman. He's with me. Lionel replied, seemingly noticing Jarek's apprehension. Oh. The young heir didn't ask anything further. The situation right now is a bit delicate. The trials will begin in another month, but that doesn't mean the city is safe. In fact, this is maybe the most dangerous time. There's a good chance that a territorial war could be sparked. Lionel scratched his nose, pretending as though he didn't plan on being responsible for starting one. Be sure to stay within the limits of the eastern sector. And, if you are going to the central tower, travel in pairs. Also, be cautious of the monuments. Lionel's eyes narrowed when he heard this, but didn't say anything more, waiting for the young heir to finish his spiel. After a while, Lionel suddenly got curious about something. What benefits are there to a territorial war? There's got to be a reason for them, right? The young heir swept a glance over Lionel. Not many dared to cut him off while he was speaking like this. Of course, that was just the young heir's illusion. Lionel had waited for a slight pause in his long-winded admonishment. It was clear that the young heir was lecturing his little sister rather than speaking for all of their benefits, so Lionel asked a question instead. There are 8 sectors to the city. Each has their own residential area and monuments. The only way to access the other sectors is through the central tower. However, due to this, it also makes it very obvious when someone is crossing over to a sector they shouldn't be in. When you enter another sector, it becomes easier to upgrade your rank, meditating before the monuments becomes easier, and the benefits for stealing abodes is also greater. Benefits of abodes? Lionel's gaze sparkled. Yes, every abode makes it easier to cultivate a specific special force. The short of it is that all benefits are greater when stealing them from another sector. But, for this reason, people are also very territorial. Considering your strength, acting on this would only lead to your death. The young heir's words were quite pointed, but Lionel didn't really care to respond directly to them. Lionel found this young heir to be quite odd. At first glance, he seemed stoic, cold and quiet, but he was actually quite long-winded. I have one more question. Lionel pressed. Are there really this many emperors? Lionel looked around at all the lit lampposts. It couldn't be that emperors were so cheap, right? Who said an emperor could only claim one house? Lionel's eyes widened. So this was how it was. Thanks for the help. Lionel said with a smile. I'll help out the Kiafur family if I can. I'll be going now. After finishing his duties, Lionel bid his farewells. His thoughts were filled with how to make his imprint as big as possible. If he wanted to be known, there was no better option than attacking other territories. However, Sil's brother wasn't wrong, he was too weak to do so now. He needed a few backup plans first. The young heir's gaze narrowed as he watched Lionel's back retreat, his sword trembling once again. Jirak followed along quickly, not knowing anything about the crazy thoughts going on in Lionel's head. Chapter 366. Hey, hey. Jirak jogged to keep up with Lionel, his heavy armor causing the paved roads to quake. Lionel looked back and couldn't help but smile. You know, for someone with such a strong wind affinity, shouldn't you wear something lighter than this, Baldy? Who knows, your hair might grow back if you stop straining yourself so much. What do you know? Jirak snapped like a cat that had its tail stepped on. Clearly, his baldness was a soft spot. It's precisely because I have a high wind affinity that I should take full advantage of it. Who else could wear such heavy armor and yet still be so fast? Lionel shook his head and didn't reply to these words. They sounded logical, but the truth was that Jarek's speed would never reach its full potential like that. Just from what Lionel could see alone, he would easily be 2 or 3 times faster if he took his armor off. On top of that, he would never be as sturdy as someone with an earth affinity either. So, he was essentially becoming decent at many things in exchange for losing out at being excellent in one lane. In a world where your life was on the line at every turn, Lionel felt that this was a mistake. But, he didn't press Jirak too much. He still needed a bodyguard, after all. So who are you really? Jirak asked curiously, leveling out his steps with Lionel. I told you already, Lionel Morales. Lionel replied casually, looking toward the next monument. You know that's not what I mean. You use a translator, so you're obviously not from this world. I hear you came out of the same carriage as Sil, but you both deny being betrothed. You should probably hide that from that madman, by the way. If he finds out that something like that happened, he might kill you for defiling his little sister. Jirak rambled. From Earth. Lionel finally responded as Jirak had a pause. Earth? Jirak's steps stopped. Lionel frowned, looking back toward Jirak. Is there a problem? No. Jirak shook his head. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Was there a need for such an exaggerated reaction? Terrain was just as bad a name as Earth, after all. It could be said that all their ancestors needed some better naming sense. Lionel wanted to say something about Jirak's weird reaction, but he realized that they had already made it to the first monument. On the way to the Emperor abodes, Lionel had already mentally marked the locations of a few monuments. Unfortunately, Lionel was so focused on the monuments before him and how they could help him find Aina that he had completely missed the complicated gaze Jirak looked toward his back with. After a full day, Lionel fell into his thoughts, organizing everything he had seen. The eastern sector had 33 monuments and Lionel had been to them all. However, there were only a minority of them that caught Lionel's attention at all. The first one was of a bowman. Unlike what Lionel had with his spear domain, he didn't have a set path to follow with his bow. However, it would be a shame to ignore his talent for marksmanship. The only issue was finding sources that could help him continuously increase his skill. Of all 33 monuments he had been to, only one of them depicted a bowman. Even now, Lionel could remember her valiant aura and golden armor. She looked like a goddess descended toward Earth. Just from the few scenes Lionel saw, he could tell that she could control the flow of a 10-kilometer radius just with her bow and arrows alone. It was a level of skill Lionel couldn't even imagine in his current state. The second monument that caught Lionel's attention was of another woman. The only unfortunate part was that she was a fire mage and not an earth or light mage. Lionel still remembered being entranced. This woman stood in the skies wearing a fiery red robe so long it extended tens of meters past her feet. Her fiery red hair was of an obscene length as well, whipping about like rays of crimson amidst the clouds. The domain that surrounded her seemed burnt to ash. The air was dry, the ground was black, the wind was scorched. It felt as though one was standing in a perpetual hell just being around her. Lionel remembered being in awe when he came out from the illusion before soon being disappointed. After all, he wasn't a fire mage. And, even though he had dream sculpted all the mage arts of Camelot, regardless of element, he had never even so much as used a fire element spell before. However, that was when something shocking happened. Lionel realized that when he looked around him, Jirak and the others who had surrounded the monument at the time had separated their distance to him by a large margin. At first, Lionel had been confused, but when he looked around, he found that there was a radius of scorched ground around him. In fact, the only things not burnt to ash near him was the little mink napping on his head without any worries and, luckily, his clothes. It was then that Lionel came to realization. His Scarlet Star Force. Top 10 amongst star elemental forces. Top 3 amongst light elemental forces. N. The very best amongst fire elemental forces. Without realizing it, Lionel's affinity for fire magic had surpassed his affinity for both earth and light elemental magic. Whether it was his metal synergy or snowy star owl lineage factors, they were all overshadowed by his innate force node. This could only be expected, after all, a lineage factor is passed down and must be slowly unlocked, whereas an innate force node was all to a person's own. Of course, Lionel's Scarlet Star Force also vastly improved his light and star element affinity. Compared to others with light and star elemental affinity, Lionel was amongst the very top few now. However, even compared to that increase, his fire affinity still gained the greatest leap. Even though he couldn't use his innate force node to its full potential now, simply by virtue of having it, all flames in the world bowed down to him. Chapter 367. The third monument that caught Lionel's attention was actually a sword-wielding man. However, this wasn't because of the weapon. Lionel had no interest in switching from the spear. In fact, he found that he was growing more and more fond of the spear every day. There were two reasons this monument caught his attention. For one, Lionel recognized a part of its aura. When he thought about it, he realized that it was very similar to the aura he had sensed on Syl's elder brother. Of course, the aura on Syl's elder brother was far weaker than the one Lionel sensed from this monument. However, it was the same aura nonetheless. As the saying went, it was important to understand one's enemy. Though Syl's brother wasn't yet at such a point with Lionel, Lionel had too much PTSD from organizations he joined betraying him. By this point, he was already on his guard and was preparing for the worst-case scenario. That said, if it was only about understanding Syl's elder brother, Lionel wouldn't be so interested in this monument. After all, no matter how much he understood the young heir, it was useless if he was too weak to do anything about it. Ultimately, what was most important was his own strength. However, there was a second matter that caught Lionel's attention. The sword-wielding man had a pair of wings. Lionel hadn't spent much time comprehending Golden Feather Step just yet. But he already understood just how important movement was in battle, especially if he was the weaker party. If one was far weaker in strength but had speed, there would always be a chance for survival. However, there were plenty of examples of stronger individuals suffering at the hands of those much faster than them. This was part of the reason Lionel didn't agree with Jarek's methods. Speed kills. What was exceptionally beautiful about this monument was that this winged swordsman placed emphasis on his speed. His movements and swords were fluid, moving together as one. The flaps of his weapon and the swings of his sword almost looked like breathing. The contraction of the diaphragm, the expansion of the lungs, the suction of air, the relaxing of the diaphragm, the shrinking of the lungs, the expelling of air, in a continuous cycle, they flowed into one another, nurturing one another, strengthening one another. Even compared to the other monuments Lionel had lost himself in, he spent an exceptionally long time at this one despite the fact he was only trying to hop from monument to monument as quickly as possible. It was thanks to this that Lionel realized something else: his dreamscape battle sense was missing. He didn't have enough fluidity. Right now, his battle sense worked by sensing a change and reacting to it. But that was entirely reliant on his opponent doing something. What if Lionel ran into a patient opponent who shared a similar battle style? How would his battle sense react when it had no information to read? Unfortunately, Diane could only store such thoughts in the back of his mind. Even this most simple version of his battle sense used up so much stamina, he couldn't imagine what would happen if he tried to add fluidity. He couldn't even wrap his mind around how he would do this. Still, this matter of fluidity taught Lionel something most could only learn after experiencing countless battles. Movement wasn't just about evading and defense, it was just as important in attacking. Only when one's steps flowed with one's actions seamlessly would one reach true mastery of their movement. Lionel was exceptionally lucky to grasp this truth before he truly began to study Golden Feather Step. It might even have the time he would need to master this technique. These were the three monuments that had caught Lionel's attention. This was a good result. Unfortunately, there was bad news. After Lionel studied all the monuments, he realized that he had been mistaken. There were no hidden techniques to learn or grasp. This meant that there were no fourth-dimensional techniques Lionel could learn to help make use of his soul force. All the monuments seemed entirely focused on aura and feel, as though it was teaching the disposition a warrior of a certain type should have. However, there were no techniques to glean from them at all. Such a reality left Lionel sighing. There are important lessons to learn, but that's about it. Lionel shook his head. These things weren't as useless as he thought. For example, the core lesson of the winged swordsman would lay a foundation for him in movement techniques that would only exponentially multiply in the future. If Lionel was correct, there were lessons to be gained from the bowman, or bowwoman, rather, and the fire mage as well. The bowwoman likely taught about control, and the fire mage definitely touched upon the concept of a domain. Still, all of these things sounded nice, but now Lionel didn't have an obvious path toward improvement. Without matching techniques, breaking into the fourth dimension wouldn't create as great a boost to his strength as he would like. Lionel looked up to the sky and sighed. It seemed that things wouldn't be as easy as he thought. He needed to talk to the dictionary to arrange his thoughts. After a while, Lionel grit his teeth. He would have to risk it. The only place he would feel safe using the dictionary was in his own protected abode. He would have to put it all on the line and claim one now. If he let things stay as is, he would eventually suffer. Hesitancy and inaction were just as bad as failing miserably at times. Lionel could feel many eyes on him. Many had been watching his every action for a long time now, wondering how long he could hold out. When everyone saw him walking back toward the abode setting, numerous spies sent to monitor his actions rushed back toward their masters, cold lights flickering in their gazes. Jianghu, who had followed Lionel all this time, frowned deeply. He couldn't help but look toward Lionel's side profile. Was he really going to do it now? Chapter 368. Lionel walked along the stone-paved roads once again, calmly observing the abodes and lampposts one by one. He was easily able to see which abodes could help with what. Most were focused on the main elements of fire, wind, earth, and water. Aside from them, there were a few rarer kinds that fell into the category of variants. The best sort of abode for Lionel would be a star elemental abode. Only such a place would be highly compatible with him and would make the process of evolving his soul force much smoother. Also, since he wasn't necessarily restricted to one abode, a metal variant of the earth element would also be greatly beneficial to him. This would help him improve his metal body at a much quicker rate. That said, this wasn't at the forefront of Lionel's mind. After all, he had long since realized that the aura beneath the gates and monuments could also work to greatly speed up the strengthening of his metal body. In fact, since the aura beneath the monuments were 10 times more concentrated, they were even better than the gates had been. Lionel continued to walk, quickly getting a bit worried. He saw some variant abodes, but he still hadn't seen a star force abode. What are you looking for? Jianghu finally couldn't hold back. In his mind, after seeing how devastating Lionel's fire affinity was, Lionel should have long since chosen an abode. They had already passed by 2 fire elemental abodes and 1 variant fire elemental abode. Of course, Jianghu had no idea that Lionel had yet to consciously work on his fire affinity before. I'm looking for a star force abode. Lionel replied. There was no need to hide anything anyway, since once he found such an abode, practically everyone would know about it. Star force? Jianghu was shocked again. It was difficult to explain just how rare those with star affinity were. They were even on par with those that had enigmatic affinities like time and space. Star force was the only force in existence that could be cultivated and used no matter the environment. There were many locations in the universe where energy of a certain kind became scarce and impossible to sense. Those who had such affinities that were unlucky enough to end up in such regions could only lament their bad luck and hope to survive. In such environments, even abilities could become useless. However, no matter where one was, there would always be star, space and time force. These 3 forces and the other rare ones like it all had this fundamental reason that set them apart. Suddenly, Jianghu laughed. No wonder, no wonder. I thought you were a madman for a second, but it seemed you had a plan too. Lionel raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? You don't have to act ignorant anymore, I see through you. Lionel frowned in confusion. No, really. Jianghu gave Lionel a weird look. You really don't know? Really? Madman. Just a madman. Jianghu grumbled. Claiming an abode requires 2 prerequisites. The first is that you must have the appropriate rank. It's possible for an emperor to claim a king's house, but it isn't possible for a king to claim an emperor's unless they upgrade their mark. The second prerequisite is that the trial of the abode must be passed. Lionel's gaze suddenly brightened, his steps coming to a halt. You mean to say that the trial that must be passed is related to the affinity of the abode? So, if I'm the only one with star force affinity. If you're the only one with star force affinity, then it would be impossible for anyone to claim your abode other than you unless they're seeking death. The trials are quite simple if you share the necessary affinity, and you can muddle your way through variant affinities as long as it's related to your main affinity. However, if you try to claim a home you have no affinity with, heavy injury is the best case scenario. Lionel's gaze brightened like two torches. Was this what they called luck? Was he finally going to get something to go his way? Lionel was a virgin and hadn't even kissed a woman before. In fact, the only times he had even been able to touch Aina somewhat intimately was when she was either unconscious or half dead. But, he could swear that being with a woman couldn't possibly feel half as good as he was feeling right now. He almost shed real tears. Jirak gave Lionel another odd look. Why does he look so happy? Why does his expression almost look lewd? Jirak almost began to shed his own tears. He could only hope that Lionel didn't use his control over his life to take his chastity. Of course, if others knew Jirak was thinking himself as chaste, he'd probably be stoned to death. After a moment of happiness, Lionel regained his composure. Even if these people couldn't try to seize his abode, the fact of the matter would be that he would still be unsafe when he left his abode. And, he would have no choice but to leave it if he wanted to make his name known to find Aina. In addition, it wasn't like he could bring the monuments into his abode either. However, this was still the greatest news he had heard in a long while. Even if he would still be at risk, he wouldn't have to worry about the 12-hour limit anymore. In addition, should things go south, he had a safe house he could return to. Of course, this was as long as no one else had a star affinity. Soon, Lionel and Jirak made it to the end of the stone-paved roads. For a moment, Lionel thought he had dropped back down to an abyss because even now, he couldn't find a star affinity abode. But, that was when his gaze landed on 6 homes that sat side by side. In fact, they were a measure larger than all the other homes. One gave off a radiant gold light. The next pulsed with darkness. The third seemed warped, dilating one's sense of time. The fourth seemed to stand in a plane of its own. It looked as though it was right before them, yet hundreds of miles away at the same time. The fifth made Lionel exceptionally excited. It, too, exuded a light. But, it was more gentle and dense than the first, not to mention warmer. This was definitely a star affinity abode. Finally, his heart rested easy. However, when he looked at the 6th house, Lionel's steps froze again as he fell into a daze. He felt as though he experienced his whole life once again. From the day he was born to this very moment right here. In his shock, Lionel saw the image of a woman gorgeous beyond words. It was the kind of beauty that seized the heart and overshadowed even young Mistress Era. She had eyes as bright as glistening emeralds, hair like a shimmering golden white waterfall, and a smile that made tears uncontrollably fall from Lionel's eyes. She held a baby in her arms, her gaze a mixture of love and unwillingness. The image was so real that Lionel felt as though he was right there. He was the baby, he was the one being looked at in such a way. Mom, Lionel had never said these words in his life. At least, he had never said it to address another person. He never thought about his mother because he couldn't even remember her. He couldn't say he felt one way or another. But, at this moment, he felt as though his heart was bleeding. How could he forget that gaze? When Lionel snapped out of it, he found himself standing in the same place staring at the same house. Lionel. Oh, you're awake. Try not to stare at that abode too much. There've been stories of others never being able to extricate themselves. I've never heard of someone falling into a trance like you did coming out. You're very lucky. Lionel blinked, trying to regain his bearing. But, the tears didn't seem to want to stop. That abode, what is it? Lionel forced out, his voice shockingly steady. That? Jirak didn't even dare to look toward the abode as he referred to it. They call it Dream Force. Chapter 369. The moment Lionel heard these words, he felt his mind tremble. After a moment, he wiped the tears from his eyes and shook his head. Lionel's personality was one that was difficult to grasp. It was hard to imagine that a person who seemed so soft-hearted as him wouldn't even spare a single thought toward his mother. It wasn't rare for children who grew up with one or no parents to have fanciful images of what could have been. Of course, some grew out of this phase while others never did. However, maybe very few were like Lionel and never had such thoughts at all. This was maybe one of Lionel's true faces. Though he loved, he also had a deeply calculating side to him. When he told his former best friend James that he would leave Aina alone if she truly rejected him, he hadn't been lying. If the words no ever came out of her mouth or her actions ever made him feel as though she was rejecting him, he wouldn't hesitate to let that part of his heart die. Lionel knew this about himself. Maybe if it wasn't for the love he gained from his father, he could have very well become someone's cold-killing tool. There really wasn't much separating such a person from himself aside from his upbringing. To now, maybe Lionel had subconsciously accepted that his mother didn't want him, so he very logically cut off that part from himself. There was no need to waste time thinking about someone who had no need for him. However, the moment he saw that gaze, everything suddenly changed for Lionel. As logical and calculating as Lionel was, he was just as loving and caring. If the gaze his mother had for him was still the same, then no matter where she was, what trouble she was in, what was keeping her from his side, he would make sure to wipe it all out. It was that simple to Lionel. There was nothing more to think about. Jianghu suddenly felt that suffocating aura once again. He could hardly move until Lionel finished going through his thoughts. What is dream force? Lionel suddenly asked, his heart growing calm. Lionel needed to know. Was it just coincidental? Or was there a reason behind everything? Jianghu hesitated. The dream force abode was an extremely enigmatic existence. According to what Jianghu knew, it didn't appear all of the time. It would often hide itself as though it was an illusion and rarely appeared. However, the times it did appear usually led to tragedy. There were no small number of geniuses who had lost themselves in an illusion just staring at it. It could be said that Jianghu was lucky to not be one of them. He had been observing Lionel this whole time because he thought he was a madman. But then, Lionel suddenly stopped and entered a daze. This luckily triggered some of Jianghu's memories, so he didn't dare to look where Lionel was looking. But, from what Jianghu knew, it should have been impossible for Lionel to wake up. Yet, not only had Lionel woken up, he had only been in a daze for a few seconds at most. This left Jianghu more shocked than almost anything else ever could. Could it be that all those legends were exaggerated? They must be. Despite thinking this, though, Jianghu still didn't dare to look toward the sixth abode. It's another high-level force. Wherever there are people, there will be dream force. So, in a way, just like how star force is never restricted by location, so is dream force. After all, if you happen to find yourself in such a place, as long as you exist, there will be dream force. But what is it exactly? Lionel asked, his expression having regained an eerie calm. He almost seemed too placid. I don't know much about it. I only heard someone once describe dream force as the representation of consciousness. Lionel's gaze sharpened. Consciousness. How much effort had the scientists of Earth put into finding the source of human consciousness? It was the one thing that even hundreds of years of technological advancement still couldn't describe. Some believed that human consciousness was stored in a soul or spirit. Others believed that everything that represented consciousness could be found within the brain and that we only couldn't describe it because we didn't understand the brain well enough. When Lionel entered this new world order, he sometimes had fleeting thoughts that maybe a soul did exist. He had seen so many fantastical powers in the past year that this was much easier to accept for him. Yet, even now, he had yet to find this so-called soul of his. One had to know that soul force was just a name. It didn't represent a spiritual form of Lionel. It was simply an extension of Lionel's senses, another form of energy. Nothing more, nothing less. This was the reason why, even though Lionel knew his ethereal glabella inside and out, he had never run into anything like a soul in there. All one could find were his embryos and his stars. There was nothing else. But what Jirak was saying now was that this dream force represented such a thing. It left Lionel feeling, well, he wasn't exactly sure how he was feeling at all. All Lionel knew was that this was the abode he would be choosing. He didn't even hesitate as he took a step toward it. Jirak panicked. "Hey, what are you doing?" Lionel smiled lightly. "Choosing an abode, obviously. You're going in the wrong direction. The star abode is over there." Lionel smiled but didn't reply. Jirak knew well what he was doing. Whether it was dangerous or not, Lionel didn't care. He needed to know why his heart was thumping like this. It was the same feeling Lionel had felt when he chose Dimensional Cleanse. It was the same feeling he had when he chose Golden Feather Step. Yet, it was several times more potent than the feeling had ever been. Were those names he chose a coincidence? Dream World. Dream Sculpt. Dreamscape. Dream Clone. How much of it was a casual name he had given his abilities and how much of it was something compelling him toward the right path? Lionel had always believed that his ability and his soul force was inextricably linked. But, what if this wasn't entirely correct? What if he was missing something? Lionel took several more steps, ignoring Jirak's attempts to stop him. Eventually, the poor bald Jirak, scared for his own safety, didn't dare approach the house any closer. Though he could stop Lionel by force with his strength, he could see a look in Lionel's eye that made him not dare to do so. Then, Lionel crossed the threshold no one else dared to. What he didn't know was that his actions would soon cause an uproar. Chapter 370. Lionel was suddenly bombarded by a surge of force. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced before. The force he was used to was hard to sense, but it was still tangible. Even someone with weak internal sight could feel it as long as the concentration was high enough. But, this force, despite being maybe in the highest concentration Lionel had ever seen, still felt unreal. The harder Lionel tried to reach out to it, the more fluidly it slipped through his fingers. It was as though Lionel was on a different plane, observing it from afar. However, despite there being such a surge, Lionel didn't feel like his life was in danger at all. In fact, he continued to walk forward without suffering any setback at all. If it wasn't for the fact he was taking his time to sense the mysteriousness of this dream force, he would have already long since crossed this trial. Before Lionel even realized it, he had made it to the door of the dream force abode. His palm reached out, touching the dark oak of the door. Click! A light clicking sound reached Lionel's ears as the door slowly swung open. At that moment, a shield of protection suddenly vibrated. The lamppost that manned the outside flickered before erupting into a blinding light that shot into the skies. The eyes of numerous elites swung in a single direction. They were all used to the signs of an abode being conquered by now. However, the signs had never been this exaggerated before. In the whole of Terrain's brave city, not a single one had ever claimed one of these special abodes. Lionel, however, had no idea that he had suddenly become the center of attention. He was entirely immersed in an all-new feeling. His body, despite standing on the ground, felt as though it was soaring into the clouds. When Lionel finally snapped out of his odd state, he was uncertain of how much time had passed. But, he was no longer worried about a time limit. Compared to the Star Force abode, this Dream Force abode was even more secure. Whereas someone bold might try to force their way through the Star Force trial, Lionel didn't believe anyone would have the guts to do so with the Dream Force abode. Facing something tangible was always easier than facing the illusory. In this abode, it was possible to fall into an illusion without even realizing what happened. If it wasn't for Lionel's high affinity with Dream Force, he would have likely fallen into an endless cycle as well. So that's how it is. Lionel exhaled a long breath, looking around his new home for the next while. He couldn't help but smile. He hadn't had a place he could call home in more than a year now. He didn't know how long he would be in this brave city, but he definitely felt at home here. The whole abode was decorated in white and black. The two shades complemented and danced with one another across the home. It was warm and pleasing to the eye, leaving Lionel feeling content. For the first time, Lionel didn't feel the need to ask the dictionary what was happening with him. He understood that compared to his affinity for fire, light, star, or earth, his affinity for dream force existed on a completely different plane of its own. It was so high, in fact, that even without being consciously aware, he had still made use of it before, whenever Lionel entered his dream world, whenever he used dream sculpt, whenever he formed a dream clone. Every time, without fail, without dream force as a core, he would have failed. To use something so unconsciously, as though he was breathing, just what level of affinity was that? But, now that Lionel knew what it was and could consciously put it into motion, whoosh! A violent torrent of force surged toward Lionel. He completely expelled all of his normal soul force. It was nothing but a hindrance to him, limiting his abilities and causing him to use more stamina to perform tasks that should have been as easy as breathing. To Lionel, soul force and dream force were like the lubricants and fuel to a well-running engine. Not only was soul force far lower in quality, when it combusted, it gave off countless impurities, making its efficiency horrid. Not everyone could do as Lionel was currently doing. Dream force represented consciousness. Those with low affinity could easily lose themselves, forgetting what was real and what was not. Their memories would become so real that it would feel as though they were reliving them in real time. Their phobias would manifest and hold control of them. Even their loves would become larger than life, enveloping their very beings. The number of pitfalls there were to using dream force were endless. Only those innately born with a comprehension of this force could make use of it without losing themselves. And, thanks to his ability, Lionel just so happened to be one of these people. The moment all of his soul force was purged, Lionel felt as though a shackle on his mind had been lifted. Dream force began to compress within his ethereal glabella, wildly surging about. Lionel wasn't worried in the slightest. The dream force he was accepting now, no matter how high level of an energy it was still considered to be within the fourth dimension. With the strength of his mind, it was child's play to accept for him. Whoosh! The force around Lionel kicked up a tempest. Lionel's hair fluttered wildly, his heavy robes billowing. What sounded like shattering glass resounded in Lionel's ears. Lionel's eyes shot open, a bright light making his pale irises seem no dimmer than his mother's bright emerald gaze for a moment. Lionel felt that his mind had never been clearer. He saw the things in the world down to their most basic building blocks, seeing through the foundation even the most complex things with just a single glance. With a flip of his palm, the dictionary appeared once again. The last time Lionel checked the level of his ability, it had just barely crossed into the bronze grade. Though this was still a fifth-dimensional ability, with the other limiters on Lionel's body, it hadn't been able to truly shine. But now, ping, subject, Lionel Morales, calculative mind, an ability capable of simplifying the complex. Evaluating power, ping, evolution stage, quasi-silver. Chapter 371. Lionel should have been shocked by this result. After all, the last time he checked, his ability was graded as Tier 3 bronze. This sort of massive leap should have been completely out of expectations. But, Lionel only nodded. This much should have been expected. After purging his soul force, his ability should have already shot up to Tier 6 or 7. Then, after breaking through to the fourth dimension within his ethereal glabella, it shot up once again to quasi-silver. It was very likely that at this moment, he had the most powerful ability on terrain. Lionel closed his eyes, focusing on the changes to his ability. Lionel already knew that he wouldn't suddenly awaken new branches to his ability. His calculative mind ability entirely relied on himself to come up with new ways to use his computer-like brain. However, he could still check to see what improvements there had been to abilities he already created. My dream clone limit is now 17, this was the first thing Lionel realized as it was the easiest to quantify. 17 might sound like a small change, but it became exponentially more difficult to split his mind the more ways he did so. Of course, it was possible for Lionel to surpass this limit of 17 if he consciously lowered the computing power of each. But, in most cases, this wouldn't be very helpful. Lionel's overall abilities gained a massive boost. He could dream sculpt in a fraction of the time. The ideas he had to improve his dreamscape and dreamscape battle sense seemed to increase like a never-ending tide. But, the most important change to Lionel was that he could see through the core secrets of the things he had dream sculpted. Lionel left his dream world and walked out of his abode. Jirak. Lionel called out. By now, Jirak was in a pitiful state. He didn't dare to look toward the abode, but he also felt conflicted in his heart. His pride wouldn't allow him to abandon Lionel. He hadn't been joking around when he said he would sign his life over. He was a real man. He refused to do anything that encroached on his ideals for himself. At that moment, Jirak had just been about to turn toward the abode. Even if he got stuck in an illusion for the rest of his life, he would still have followed through on the thoughts of his heart. But, who knew that the moment he spun around, a vicious glint in his eyes as though the abode was his mortal enemy, he would hear Lionel's voice suddenly call out. Lionel looked toward Jirak with an amused expression. What are you doing out there? Hurry up. Jirak stood rooted in place for a long while. Did I already fall into the illusion? Fuck, my life is over. Lionel laughed and shook his head. He hadn't had a close friend since James betrayed him. In fact, he had very much avoided it, closing himself off slightly. But, he felt it wouldn't be bad to have someone like Jirak around, at least for now. Lionel waved a finger, causing a pillar of earth to shoot up from behind Jirak and send him soaring toward the house. Ah! Jirak grabbed onto his ass with both hands, soaring through the skies with a wronged expression on his face. Lionel let Jirak land before the door. No way he was going to catch something so heavy. But, this seemed to wake Jirak up from his stupor. You really claimed this abode? Lionel smiled. I have some stuff to do before we go again. Just stay in here, it's safer. I'm sure there will be people surrounding this place soon enough. With that, Lionel turned and entered, walking up to the highest room of the abode. Though he didn't know Jirak well, his actions just now were enough for Lionel to take a chance on his character. Even if Lionel was wrong about him, with Lionel's current abilities, he could definitely stop anyone he didn't want spying on him from doing so. Jirak stood in a daze as Lionel disappeared. Bang! Someone tell me what the hell just happened. Within the central tower, numerous meetings just like this were taking place. As though by tacit understanding, almost all emperors and most kings not involved in Lionel's claiming of the dream abode came to this very place. Please calm your anger, young master. All those we've sent to investigate haven't come back. We're unsure of what happened as well. Damn it. The young man in question knew that he couldn't go and investigate himself. If he did so, that would be an act of war on the eastern sector and he couldn't bear this burden alone. It was fine if he sent middling soldiers out to do his bidding. Who would care about a few soldiers? They weren't enough of a threat to be taken seriously. But, if he, as a king, made a move of his own, it would definitely stir up some problems. The dream abode had been claimed. The dream abode has been claimed. At that moment, a soldier came sprinting into the tower, almost tripping over his own feet. The entire environment froze. Had it been the light or dark abode, it would have been shocking, but easier to accept. Had it been the star, space, or time abode, the whole of terrain would have been shaken, but it would still cool down after a while. But, for it to be the dream abode, it felt as though everyone had entered an illusory realm of their own. Did they really hear correctly? Rain-Red Solar, Jilnia Falls and Wheeless Mirage all sat together, discussing this very topic. But, when they heard the news, they too came to a grinding halt. Then, they all looked toward one another and understood something immediately. Their mission this time was far too important. It was so important that they even stopped personally overseeing the capture of that ugly bitch. For such a variable to appear now of all times, they had to find a way to deal with it. Chapter 372. Lionel had no idea about the commotion he had caused. But, truthfully, this was a matter of choice rather than one of ignorance. All he cared about at this moment was increasing his own strength. The question laid in how he would do so. At the moment, Lionel sat in the pool of his abode setting in a silent state of meditation. His mind rushed through several potential plans as he organized himself. The quickest way to improve himself was likely with the Four Seasons Realm Force Arts of Merlin's trials. With the improvement to his ability added atop the help of the natural force art, it most definitely wouldn't take him the years he previously thought it would. Lionel had already done a quick estimate. It would take him about a single day to perfect dream sculpt one of them now. And, if he wanted to fuse his comprehensions of winter, spring, summer and fall, he felt it would take about a week or two. In total, if Lionel wanted to grasp the Four Seasons realm for his spear, bow and fists, it would take about 2 to 3 months. This was definitely a far shorter evaluation than he previously had. The only unfortunate part was that these wouldn't be his own comprehensions. As such, the power he displayed wouldn't be as exaggerated as allowing him to challenge the peak of the fourth dimension. For someone weak, the best thing they can do to keep themselves safe would be to have mobility and to keep a certain distance. Lionel knew this well. So, for now, he set aside the idea of comprehending his spear and fist techniques. During the trip here, Lionel had already completely grasped Chain Domain and conquered his first spear peak. There was no need to spend any more time on it for now. In fact, Lionel was leaning toward comprehending the Four Seasons realm with his spear on his own. But, this was still a matter for the future. Focus on movement and long-ranged attacks. When Lionel came to this conclusion, he had made up his mind. He was able to quickly break down the things he needed to do. The first and most obvious was to awaken the speed branch of his Snowy Star Owl lineage factor. The second was to master Golden Feather Step. The third was to comprehend and fuse his comprehensions of the Four Seasons realm for his bow embryo. And the fourth was to modify his use of Camelot's spell arts to make them useful against fourth-dimensional opponents. In the past, Lionel didn't have the computational ability to do this on his own. But, at the moment, he was feeling much more confident. Having made his decision, Lionel's eyes slowly opened. A smile crept onto his face as he watched the little mink float in the pool. The little guy snored away without a care in the world, causing Lionel to chuckle. Lionel entered his dream world once again. This time, he immediately split himself into 16 dream clones. Then, he assigned 4 to each one of his chosen tasks. As for his 17th dream clone, he had it completely focus on absorbing dream force. The only way to sustain such continuous activity would be to do exactly this. If Lionel was in any other environment, he would likely have to take a break every few hours. This had happened to him during his trip here in the carriage with Era. This was why Era could so clearly tell when he slipped into and out of his meditative state. But the dream abode had such a high density of dream force that Lionel didn't even need to worry about it. And, since he was currently within the segmented cube, he could allow it to slowly gain the characteristics of the dream abode as well. At least for while Lionel was within the fourth dimension and fourth-dimensional dream force was still helpful to him, he could enter the abode or lab setting to gain the same benefits he was now. Golden Feather Step, clones. After asking the dictionary, Lionel conjured up an environment perfect for training movement within his dream world. His dream clones each stood atop thin metal poles barely the width of the balls of their feet. Below, there was nothing but an endless abyss. In their minds, the movements of Golden Feather Step were replayed again and again. Each of them tried to grasp the artistic conception of the technique. Lionel had no idea that his thoughts now were far beyond a normal person's. Artistic conception was usually a term reserved for the universe cycles. But, to try and paint a picture without even considering the universe cycles. The outcome would be quite interesting indeed. However, Lionel had always been doing this subconsciously. In the past, he had practiced chasing wind, without even opening its cover. What was this if not relying on artistic conception? When Lionel chose Golden Feather Step, what he chose wasn't its name or its power, he chose its feeling. Speed Branch Lineage Factor clones. Lionel entered a deep introspection of his body, sensing the shackles that bound his blood. Having access to a particular branch didn't necessarily mean that one would awaken it. However, to now, Lionel had been able to awaken the first levels of both the healing branch and the wisdom branch. The first opening of the wisdom branch was known as blossoming mind. It opened up one's thoughts, increasing speed of thought and solidifying the foundation for further cultivation of the mind. Unfortunately, Lionel didn't gain much from this other than smoothing out his path toward the fifth dimension. After all, his own ability overshadowed any benefits one could gain from unlocking this first shackle. The first opening of the healing branch was known as instant recovery. As long as there was an adequate separation of time, Lionel could instantly recover back to his peak state. It had already been months since the last time Lionel used this ability, but he still had a few more months to go before he could use it again. Luckily, this opening of this branch had the passive ability of multiplying the impact of normal healing, something Lionel had experienced personally already during his battle with Lamorak. The first opening of the speed branch, however, was a special case for the snowy star owl. It had a slight mutation as compared to the normal speed branch of other lineage factors because it was tailored toward winged beasts. It was known as first flight. Chapter 373. Of course, Lionel wasn't going to sprout wings just by unlocking the first of his lineage factors chains. Such a mutation would only occur at a much deeper level of integration. First flight represented the invocation of the essence of the snowy star owl's speed. For seasons clones, each one of Lionel's 4 dream clones focused on a different force art. They floated before his main body, each capturing a different scene. Despite the fact Lionel had already been bestowed the winter legendary skill, he still chose to comprehend it on his own again. It was then he suddenly realized something shocking. When he finally grasped winter on his own, he realized it was different from the comprehension Merlin's trial had bestowed to him. It can't be, Lionel froze for a moment. Compared to the comprehension Merlin's trial had given him, the one he comprehended by dream sculpting was several times deeper. In fact, Lionel felt as though he could sense the essence of the seasons as though it was his very own understanding. Lionel was stunned. What limited those who chose the second path of comprehension, relying on another, was that their understanding would never be as deep as the original creator. However, by dream sculpting these force arts, Lionel had integrated this understanding so deeply within himself that it almost felt like his own. Lionel was shocked to his core. When he realized this, he immediately consulted the dictionary. It was only after this that he finally calmed down. So that's how it is. Lionel learned from the dictionary that there were 2 things that distinguished the second and third forms of comprehension. The first was as Lionel thought, how deeply one comprehended. But the second was how much universal force one could evoke. Universal force was the strength behind the 4 seasons realm. When one comprehended one or all of the 4 seasons, it was possible to use universal force to increase one's strength. This was where the power of the realm came from. When one comprehended a universe cycle on their own, the amount of universal force one could use was far greater than when one relied on someone else. This essentially meant that Lionel was now in an in-between realm. He felt as though the comprehension was his own, but the universal force hadn't recognized it as such. As a result, the power he could evoke from the 4 seasons realm was more than someone who comprehended it with the help of another, but less than if he had comprehended it all on his own. Even though this wasn't as great as Lionel had been hoping, this was still excellent news. The second form of comprehension would have just been a minor boost to his strength, but this was much, much, much more of a boon. Lionel's confidence grew as he once more sunk back into his meditative state. Mage art clones. After the increased strength to Lionel's ability, he found that his ability to master force arts had skyrocketed. Not only could he draw mage arts much more quickly than he had in the past, he felt that he could even freelance their symbols to a small extent. Though freelancing lowered the strength of the art, it once again increased the casting speed and gave Lionel much more freedom in battle. However, what Lionel needed wasn't just speed, he needed added strength. There were 2 avenues he could travel down to accomplish this. The first was the layering art. Lionel had already used this art many times in battle. It allowed a mage to stack the same spell multiple times to increase its power. Unfortunately, it had its own limitations. For one, the maximum number of stacked spells for a 3-star Magus art was 3 and no more. This wasn't anywhere near enough to harm a fourth-dimensional entity. In addition, the second problem was time. To layer multiple arts, it was obviously necessary to draw each one of them individually. This would increase casting time and not be conducive to battle. Of course, this second problem overshadowed the fact that it would also take a lot of stamina to layer so many arts. To Lionel, the problem of time and stamina wasn't really an issue. He could cast even a 3-star Magus art in a split second in his current state. The main issue was the limitation of the layering art. If Lionel wanted to go with this option, he would have to research into either making the layering art better or into making his 3-star Magus arts better complements to it. However, Lionel felt he had a much better idea than this. His 4 clones sat in regions of their own, each of them having numerous force arts floating around them. They spanned from the simplest apprentice arts to the highest Magus arts. Every so often, they would break down into smaller parts. Anyone watching from the outside would realize that it wasn't that there were apprentice arts and Magus arts floating around Lionel, but rather that the Magus arts were becoming apprentice arts. Lionel continued breaking down complex Magus arts into their simpler forms, them forming them up once again. He seemed to be searching for something, looking for a path forward. Soon, there came a point where nothing but apprentice arts remained. Then, Lionel broke them down further. While Lionel was entirely focused on training himself, a month ticked by, then a second. Lionel had unknowingly turned 19, being completely none the wiser. Outside the dream abode, the crowd continued to grow. But, if one paid attention, it would become clear that for such a large crowd, the surroundings were eerily silent. In fact, not a single person was moving, as though they had all entered a trance. The higher-ups who sent all of their subordinates here felt a slight tinge of fear, all the legends of the dream abode coming back to their memories. If they weren't certain before, they were absolutely sure now that someone had claimed it. But, how could they deal with someone they couldn't even approach? It was only then that the crowd before the abode grew stagnant. From afar, the sight caused many to shudder in fear. While everyone was distracted, though, changes began to occur at the gates of Brave City once again. The first period of entry for Brave City was known as the quota period. In this period, every family, city, and power would only allow a certain number of individuals to enter. This was the calmest state Brave City would be in during its active period, but it also only allowed a limited number of individuals to benefit. After this period ended, the second period would begin. During this time, restrictions would lift. But, the danger would multiply several folds. Whereas in the beginning, Brave City exuded a valiant majesty, it now seemed as though blood washed its walls. A suffocating killing intent hung around it, causing the weak to collapse and die beneath the pressure. No small number of individuals who overestimated themselves collapsed, never to breathe another breath. It was when this second period began that Xyler looked toward the massive looming gates with fists clenched and determination in his eyes. He wasn't the only one, but his will seemed to tower over the others. He still remembered Lionel's words that day, "Second place was never an option for me." Blood leaked from Xyler's fingers. "Second place isn't an option for me either." He took a firm step forward, his resolve forming a tangible shield around him. At that moment, approaching from the north, there was another who looked toward the bloody gates in silence. They had a back that hunched grotesquely and were shrouded in a black cloak. The scent of blood that hung around them seemed to rival even Brave City itself. Without hesitation, this figure too stepped forward. Chapter 374. Lionel slowly opened his eyes, exhaling a long breath. He didn't seem to look much different than he had just a few months ago. Lionel passed a hand across his face. He remembered that in his youth he had always wanted a full, connecting beard. But, ever since his hair changed, he had stopped growing facial hair. He couldn't decide whether this was a good or a bad thing. Regardless, if his facial hair came out as difficult to cut as his bronzed hair, it might be better that he never did. As things stood now, Lionel wasn't even sure if a full-force swing from Syl's elder brother's sword could cut his hair. It would probably only get worse when he entered the perfect stage. Lionel shuddered slightly, thinking about what it would mean if he had to take a blade with such force to his face. What would happen if I had to kiss Aina with such tough facial hair? Would I pierce her skin? Forget it, forget it. I'll just give up on that dream. Just like that, Lionel had gone from a youth who dreamed of having a full beard to one who would stay cleanly shaven for the rest of his life. Sometimes, the dream of a man could only die as he matured. Author's note: a moment of silence for our favorite MC. Lionel walked down the stairs of the dream abode. Not much had been touched in his absence, at least not on the second or third floors. It was only after he made it down to the first that he found Jirak. "You're finally out." Lionel gave Jirak a weird look. It wasn't because of what he said, but because of the enthusiasm he said it with. Was there a need to look so happy? Jirak's expression wasn't one of meeting a friend for the first time in a long time. It was more like he had just spent weeks in a bone-dry desert and finally found some water. The reaction was completely disproportional to the situation. "What's wrong?" Lionel asked. Jirak shook his head and stood up. At the moment, he was no longer wearing his heavy armor and had swapped it out for some lighter clothing. "I felt like I was going crazy. There's nothing to do in this house and I can't even cultivate. If I absorbed this dream force, I'd probably end up like all of them." Jirak pointed toward the curtained windows. The sun hardly shone through them at all, so it was impossible to see what was on the outside. But, clearly Jirak had taken a peek or two in the past. Hearing Jirak's words, Lionel felt a bit bad. He had brought Jirak in so that he would be safe. But, he had forgotten to consider that it would be difficult for Jirak to do much of anything here. With Lionel's protection, it wasn't a problem to stay here and not fall into an illusion. In fact, even if he did, Lionel could still pull him out of it. However, other than this, he was pretty limited. Lionel realized then that he might have been a bit too rash. It would have definitely been better for Jirak had he gone off to claim a king abode for himself. "Wait." Lionel shook his head. "What did you mean by that? Who's all of them?" Jirak smiled bitterly. "Check for yourself." Lionel slowly walked to the windows and pulled the curtain aside. When he saw what Jirak had already previously been aware of, he was speechless. What the hell? There was a sea of people outside his home. Though it wasn't as exaggerated as being within the hundreds, there were definitely more than a few dozen. If such a crowd appeared in a normal suburb of Earth, it would be enough to shake any homeowner. Yet, all of these people were frozen solid, not moving a single inch or saying a single word. "I guess the protections of this abode are even better than I thought. Let alone challenging it, they can't even look at it. Well, this definitely makes leaving easier." Lionel smiled. He had wanted to become known all this time so that Aina would know to come find him. So, to him, all this commotion was good news. Though he could awaken all these people, he had no reason to do so just yet. Without saying a word to Jirak, Lionel made his way to the door and swung it open. Hey. My armor." "You don't need it." Lionel replied. "You." Jirak felt aggrieved, but his armor wasn't something he could put on in a split moment. It was extraordinarily heavy for him. "Come on. You're a wind affinity warrior, that armor is only hampering you." Lionel turned an eye toward Jirak that made the latter shudder. He felt as though Lionel had seen through him completely with that one glance. How'd he change so much? I need my armor," Jirak said. Lionel frowned. He hadn't expected Jirak to be so set on this. "Fine. Forget it." Jirak smiled somewhat, but it seemed forced as he hurriedly put his black armor back onto his body. It was only after he finished that he sighed a breath of relief as though he had been naked without it. Lionel nodded and they headed out of the door, not bothering to hide their presence much. Considering the current situation, it was already difficult enough to monitor them in the first place. Still, to no one's surprise, those kings and emperors had managed to find a loophole. If one was far enough away from the abode, the dream force couldn't affect them. Realizing this, many left their scouts with special long-range sensory abilities in the central tower to monitor the dream abode from afar. The moment the doors swung open, they had all already been informed. But, by the time those gears had gotten into motion, Lionel had already made it to his first destination. The monument of the winged swordsman. Chapter 375. The truth was that no one knew who it was had claimed the dream abode. It was only after seeing Lionel exit that people finally got a look at just who this individual was. So, when Lionel made it to the stone monument, not a single person spared him a glance. Of course, that was only because they didn't notice his emperor brand immediately. Now that Lionel knew his becoming famous was inevitable, he put away his overinflated bravado and went back to his normal disposition. So, not many eyes were on him to begin with. "Jirak, this monument is very useful for you," Lionel suddenly said. "Huh? What?" Jirak's eyes widened, then scanned the surroundings to see if anyone was listening in on their conversation. Lionel chuckled. "Don't worry, no one can hear me but you. It's just a single noise cancellation spell." Lionel had used plenty of these spells to form his maze back during Merlin's random event. Using it now in conversation wasn't an issue. That said, Lionel found that casting the same spells in a fourth-dimensional world had severely lowered effects. For example, a teleportation spell that would have usually carried him tens of meters would be lucky to shift him 1 or 2 meters. Still, for such a low-level spell, it could get the job done. It was only after hearing Lionel say this that Jirak sighed a breath of relief. "You're a mage?" "No, forget that. What do you mean this monument can help me? Is there a secret?" "Of course there is. Did you think that these monuments just stood here to tell you about how many women these generals took back to their tents?" Jirak grinned. "What better source of encouragement is there than this?" Lionel seemed to have almost forgotten who he was dealing with. He almost couldn't refrain from rolling his eyes. "The stories written on this monument may or may not be true, I don't know. But, what I do know is that the story isn't nearly as important as what's hidden within. You need to brace yourself and touch the monument with your internal sight." Jirak hesitated upon hearing this. The reason most didn't dare to do this was because the pressure around the monument was too great. Internal sight seemed intangible, but it was still connected to one's mind. Under equally intangible pressure, it could suffer damage and cause backlash to its owner. So, under such conditions, not many dared to even test Lionel's theory, let alone going as far as to observe the monument with it. "This is something you'll have to figure out yourself," Lionel said. "I've already given you all the information you need to know." Lionel sighed internally. He could tell that Jirak had a mental roadblock somewhere, but he wasn't some sort of guru, nor had he known Jirak for long enough to extend advice to him. Maybe to Jirak, he had already hidden it well. In truth, most wouldn't be able to pick up on it at all. The fact Lionel had was just a testament to his observational abilities. With these words said, Lionel took several steps forward and entered the aura field of the stone monument. It was only after he did this that many turned a curious eye over to him. An emperor. It had to be known that emperors and kings were almost all accounted for. Gathering information on such people was usually the topmost priority of anyone within these city walls. For them to not recognize such a person. Just who was he? The second phase had started not long ago. Could it be that there was someone hidden within the general population with such talent? No one here believed that they had really missed out on Lionel. It must be that he was new. And, if he was new, then that must be that he had entered without a quota during the second phase. And, by extension, that must be that he wasn't a part of the city lord structure or the powers. There was no way such a talent would be abandoned without a quota by such powers, right? But, wouldn't they have also known that a new emperor appeared? After all, there was only one gate in their eastern sector, as these people were trying to think about who Lionel might be, he had already crossed the 5-meter mark toward the stone monument, causing their eyes to almost bulge out from their sockets. It was no problem for an emperor to enter such a close range. The issue was doing it so quickly. It was as though Lionel wasn't even feeling any pressure to begin with. In the blink of an eye, Lionel had already become the closest to the stone monument. Yet, he didn't stop. He strolled forward, soon becoming so close to the monument that he could reach out a hand and touch it. By now, even Lionel was feeling impossibly great pressure. His bones creaked and his muscles tensed. However, compared to others, he was much more leisurely for one specific reason: he felt none of the mental pressure others did. With a leap, Lionel jumped toward the top of the monument. A green light lit the bottoms of his soles. 2 more jumps later, he landed atop the tall monument. Lionel's body shuddered when he touched the monument. His blood seemed to roll in reverse, but his strong body withstood it. He forcefully suppressed it and sat down in meditation under the astonished gazes of all those around him. It wasn't long before Lionel had completely forgotten everything in his surroundings, his mind becoming as calm as the surface of a lake. Who knew that the moment Lionel settled into a rhythm, a blinding pillar of red light would shoot up into the skies from the direction of the central tower? No matter how shocked everyone was by Lionel, this red pillar took up all of their attention. Someone was invading their eastern sector. The only person who didn't seem to react to this at all was Lionel, who continued to meditate. After all, he had already guessed that something like this would happen. A red pillar wouldn't appear for anyone at and below the royal rank. The only explanation was that kings and emperors had made their move. And they were obviously coming for him. Chapter 376. Lionel's mind was filled with visions of the winged swordsman. It was quite a beautiful sight to behold. Every motion was smooth and flowed into the next. The flap of his wings, the intake of a breath, the swing of his sword. His steps, his force, his thoughts. It was all in perfect union. The longer Lionel watched, the deeper he dove into the world. He could feel the familiar energies trying to assault his mind. But, compared to the past where he nearly died, it almost felt like something was tickling him. The capacity of his mind was simply too far beyond what it had been in the past. Eventually, Lionel felt that he had been far too cautious. Without hesitation, he began to reflect on the natural force art that called his dream world home. In that instant, he no longer felt like he was an observer. It was as though he had taken over the body of the winged swordsman. He even felt like he was a master swordsman, ruling over the world with a single blade. Lionel was very familiar with this feeling. Every time he began to comprehend a new spear, this was exactly the same feeling he would have. The artistic conception engraved itself into his mind. It's a much higher level of movement control compared to the primitive man. Lionel's heartbeat slowly descended, reaching a calm state once more. In fact, he felt as though the pressure the stone monument had on him was lessened by several degrees. The primitive man taught Lionel the value of body control. When he ran, the movement of his arms and torso were just as important as the movement of his legs. When he used his hands to attack, the placement of his feet and the torque of his hips was just as important as the placement of his arms. This was a comprehension Lionel had slowly built upon the more spear consciousnesses he absorbed. If he went back now, the deficiencies of the primitive man were too many, the most blatant of which was the fact this consciousness only focused on the body but not enough on force. However, regardless, Lionel was endlessly thankful for the foundation the primitive man gave him. Thanks to this foundation, Lionel felt that he could grasp the mysteries of this winged swordsman with much more ease. There's something I'm missing. This feeling is definitely very important to this world, but I know nothing about it. I'll have to ask the dictionary about it when I have time. Lionel opened his eyes and smiled, feeling very satisfied with his gains. He didn't expect to master the secrets of this stone monument so quickly, but this was definitely a good thing. It seemed he had underestimated the benefits his ability had bestowed upon him. This made Lionel even more eager to move on to the next monument. Much like the primitive man was a great foundation for this winged swordsman's stone monument, Lionel felt that the primitive woman's consciousness would be a great foundation for the Bao woman's stone monument. Lionel still didn't know much about what Camelot called the general star even now. But, he felt if he comprehended the Bao woman's artistic conception, he would come to a truer understanding of just what it meant to be a general star. Lionel hopped down from the stone monument and walked toward Jirak, completely ignoring all the gazes around him. Jirak, you stay here. I'll be going to another stone monument. Jirak didn't know how to respond. Before he could say anything, Lionel had already vanished into the distance. Unfortunately for those who had come to learn more about the person who claimed the dream abode, they had run into a bit of a sticky situation. Just when they wanted to charge into the eastern sector, they found a white-robed young man in their way. The young man didn't say much. He simply stood there, his aura calm. Despite the fact there were several kings before him, he didn't say a single word. It was as though these kings really weren't worth much of anything to him. The kings froze when they saw such a scene. Anared, what do you mean by this? One of the kings narrowed his eyes. Clearly, he recognized this white-robed young man. In fact, if Lionel had been there, he too would recognize this young man as none other than Sil's elder brother. What do I mean? Anared's expression remained placid. You're invading my sector yet have the face to ask that? Stop twisting the facts, Anared. You know exactly why we're here. Oh. And I'm supposed to just allow you through to satisfy your own curiosity? And then what? There's only me here yet so many of you, I'm just supposed to take your word that you'll take a look and then leave? Do you take me for an ignorant fool? The expression of the kings flickered. Even if their main purpose here was to find out who owned the dream abode, there was no way that some of the more sinister among them hadn't thought of taking advantage of the situation. After so many of them flooded into the eastern sector, how could they possibly defend against them all? There were bound to be numerous benefits. At that same time, Anared's words spoke to something else. Before, Lionel had asked Anared if there really were so many emperors after seeing the state of the number of lit lampposts. Back then, Anared had simply answered that there was no restriction to the number of abodes a single emperor could claim. But, what Lionel hadn't realized back then was that, there was only ever Anared. There were no other emperors in the eastern sector but Lionel himself. Fine. They won't enter then. But what about us? At that moment, Anared's expressionless visage became a hint more serious. The emperor-level characters had made themselves known. Chapter 377. Rainred stepped forward, the crowd of kings splitting for him. He wore the same black robes accented with deep blue soft armor. He was a young man of charming looks and a somewhat dark gaze. And, unlike in the past, he wasn't followed by either Jianghu nor Wheelus of World's End Falls and Mirage Pavilion respectively. That said, he hadn't come alone either. He was followed by another pair of woman and man. Though, unlike Wheelus and Jianghu who couldn't have been more different from one another, this pair looked strikingly similar. At a glance, it was easy to make out that they were siblings, fraternal twins, in fact. This pair of twins walked side by side, their shoulders practically rubbing against one another. And, judging by their demeanor, they most definitely weren't subordinated to Rainred either. At the end of the first phase, there had been 7 emperors total. Lionel, Anared, Rainred, Jianghu, Wheelus and, these twins. The Moon siblings. For 2 emperor-level talents to appear in just one family, one could imagine the luck it would take. And most could only do exactly that, imagine. The Moon family, however, didn't have to do this. They birthed a brother-sister pair just 40 or so years ago that carried the hope of their future. Since this was a family, it was no surprise that they were a part of the city lord power structure and founded their strength upon governance and commerce. However, Anared and the rest of the Kiafur family had known for a long time that the Moon family had been leaning toward the powers for a long time already. Still, this situation likely had little to do with their affiliations. They were most likely just as curious as everyone else who this mysterious person who managed to claim the dream abode was. The truth was that even Anared only had a good idea of who it was. After all, as far as he was aware, there was only one other emperor. However, he had yet to confirm it, mostly because he too didn't dare to casually approach that abode. That said, that appearance of this person coincided with that young man's disappearance. Fine. If it's only you three, I can accept it. Anared replied calmly. However, if any others try to take advantage of the situation, don't blame me for being rude. The sword that floated to Anared's back vibrated wildly as though thirsting for blood. Beneath his might, several kings paled, unable to gather up the courage to battle. The sister moon sibling smiled. Her lips were such a bright shade of red that it seemed she had just been sipping blood from a wine glass. Lead the way. Her voice was so sweet it almost made one forget the tension in the atmosphere. Everyone here was intelligent. It was obvious that if Anared had a choice, he wouldn't allow any of them through no matter whether the number was small or not. As emperors, they had all participated in the Brave City trial before, so they knew what kind of advantages a successful invasion could give. Under normal circumstances, no one would ever give an enemy even an inkling of a chance at gaining an advantage. However, whether it was because he felt he couldn't face so many enemies or whether he wanted to conserve his strength, Anared didn't want to set off the sparks of war just yet, at least not until the third phase. Anared turned and started leading the three of them toward the Emperor abodes. But, before he could get very far, he heard another familiar giggle. Young heir Kiafur, you don't need to insult our intelligence like this, right? You're going in the wrong direction. The sister moon sibling spoke again, her voice light and airy. It somehow both made one comfortable and cold at the same time. Anared's step paused. Since you know where he is, point me in the right direction. His voice didn't give way to any embarrassment. He really didn't know where Lionel was. But, the three emperors who followed him shared a knowing glance. With the strength of these four emperors, it wasn't a surprise that they didn't take long to find Lionel. However, when Anared's gaze landed on him, his pupils couldn't help but constrict. At that moment, Lionel was the center of everyone's attention. He sat atop yet another stone monument, completely lost in his own world. Compared to his emperor brand seemed particularly dazzling, obscuring the black monitoring mark that was once the centerpiece of his face. Even when everyone was shocked by the sudden appearance of four more emperors, Lionel was unmoved. Or, rather, it was more accurate to say that he didn't spare any of his thoughts toward them. Though he knew four more individuals had appeared, he didn't stop his meditation. Rainred and the twins were stunned for a moment. Third dimension? The sister moon siblings' words were just as gentle on the ears as usual. However, this time, rather than just being calming and cold, it felt as though a bomb had erupted amidst the crowd. Do you know who he is? Rainred looked toward the Kiafur family heir. Anared sent a noncommittal glance over. He's the seated participant of my Kiafur family. He is courting my younger sister. The three emperors froze. However, it was then they remembered. There was an emperor that entered the eastern sector during the first phase. The commotion that young man caused was not small. In fact, the whole city quaked. Unfortunately, since then, no one had heard from the young man at all. And, this young man had also ignored the unspoken rules and had yet to visit the central tower. Over time, there had been so many things to deal with that this young man floated to the backs of their mind. Rainred frowned as he observed Lionel. This made things even more troublesome. The good news was that this emperor was still in the third dimension. This wasn't much to worry about. But, there were certain things during the trial that wouldn't strictly rely on strength. In addition, he wouldn't be easy to deal with regardless thanks to Anared's protection. Wait. Rainred's eyes narrowed. Isn't that a monitoring brand? Why does your seated participant have such a thing? It was difficult to spot beneath the Emperor brand. But, after noticing it, it was hard to unsee it. However, Anared's response was just as cool and collected. Is there a rule that said someone who's branded can't participate? You know as well as I do that this brand only means he is being monitored, not that he is a criminal. In addition, it will only be for a period of 3 years. That isn't what I meant. Rainred responded. Why would someone of your family be under suspicion? And, why is it that I didn't know that your family had recruited such a genius? Is there a need for you to know everything about my family? Anared gaze sharpened in warning. All right. The sister moon sibling got between the two. We only came here to form relationships, not break them. Can't we just have a conversation with him? What do you say, young man, will you come down? The final part of her words were aimed at Lionel. On terrain, no matter what man heard a request from such a beautiful lady, they would likely do their best to please. However, despite the words traveling to Lionel's ears, he didn't react. How rude was it to ask someone in the middle of meditation to come down and talk for your own convenience? Had Lionel not been able to split his mind, the act of the moon sister sending her voice toward him like this could have caused him to suffer backlash. An awkward silence fell over the stone monument region as Lionel continued to meditate. At that moment, the ever-silent brother moon sibling suddenly opened his eyes, a murderous glint lighting them. Chapter 378. Even among those of terrain, the moon siblings stood out. They had flowing silver hair, overly pale skin, and a pair of red lips that seemed to drip of blood. If Lionel cared to observe them during the critical juncture of his comprehension, he would definitely assume them to be the vampires of legend and give himself a good chuckle. That said, seemingly going with this theme, when the brother moon sibling opened his eyes, the murderous aura seemed to be perfectly in line with this. It seemed that even compared to Anared, he was that much more protective of his own sister. Just when he was about to make a moon, his sister pinched the sleeves of his silver robes. The brother moon sibling looked toward her, wondering why it was he was stopped. There was nothing he hated more than this. Had it not been for the fact they were family, maybe this would have been enough for him to lash out. However, his sister didn't explain. She simply looked toward Lionel, the smile on her face not fading in the least. Brother can't even approach the stone monument so closely. It's not a matter of not being physically capable, but rather a limitation of our minds. If brother really attacked now, he would be at a great disadvantage almost immediately. It seems that this man was already aware of this. This made everything more complicated. Despite being out in the open, Lionel was probably in the safest place he could be with the exception of his own abode. At that moment, a group came rushing in, seemingly finding out about all the commotion. Big brother. Syl's voice rang out from amidst them. But, before she could say more, she was stunned silent by the sight of Lionel and 3 other emperors. The other seated participants of the Kiafur family rushed in after her. Though they were here to participate, another one of their tasks was to protect the young family miss whenever they could. They had had their hands full over the last few days trying to keep Syl away from the dream abode. But this time, they couldn't stop her at all. Anared swept a glance over them that made them shudder. They knew he was reprimanding them for failing their task to keep her away. Come here, Syl, Anared said somewhat coldly. He felt safer when his sister was right by his side. At that moment, the situation suddenly changed. Everyone's gaze unexpectedly shot away from Lionel and toward the eastern sector gates. Someone was crossing the second phase trial. Though it was true that Lionel's actions were a far greater rarity, someone passing the second phase was definitely a major event as well. They all watched as the gates trembled. They could sense the perseverance of the person on the other side. One could imagine the hardship one needed to face to cross the bloody aura of the second phase. It took several moments, but eventually, the smallest soldier doors shook open, cracking open just a fraction. A figure squeezed through, his appearance disheveled and bloody. But, that was when something heart-wrenching occurred. Just when the figure was almost all the way through, the doors slammed shut, catching the ankle of their right foot. An agonizing scream shook the eastern sector as the person collapsed onto the dirt roads of Brave City. Blood pooled at their legs, dyeing the ground a harsh crimson as the figure convulsed. The amount of perseverance it took to cross the barrier of aura was astronomical. It was no surprise that this person had no energy left. To deal with such an injury at such a time, everyone was stunned. But they couldn't have expected for the silent, unmoving Lionel to suddenly awaken at that moment. Seeing the situation, Lionel stood, his body shooting forward. In that moment, if one wasn't looking closely, it would feel as though a bird had just soared over their heads. The pupils of the four emperors all constricted at once. The Baowoman's stone monument was quite close to the gates. And, due to the fact that all the abodes in this region were just various sized tents, there was nothing obstructing their view right to them. In what felt like an instant, Lionel appeared beside this person. Xyler. Lionel mumbled. At that moment, the familiar face shook on the ground. He seemed to have gone into shock. As a warrior of the fourth dimension, such an injury should have been painful, but definitely not to the point of putting him into such a state. The only explanation was that Xyler had given his everything to reach this point. He didn't have any more energy left to give. Lionel's body suddenly burst with a blinding golden light. Light elemental force surged toward him from all sides. For a moment, his flowing bronze-gold hair made him look as though he was a deity. Even compared to the past, calling upon the light element was far easier for Lionel. In fact, he felt the difference was easily tens of times. Part of this was because of the strengthening of his mind, but maybe the most important part was his innate force node. Grand Heel. A surging wind shook the surroundings. If one looked closely, it was possible to see that in addition to the main force art, countless smaller ones hovered around Lionel, feeding into the main force art as though playing an important supporting role. Under the stunned gazes of everyone, Xyler's shivering slowly came to a stop. And then, his severed leg began to slowly reform itself. Though it failed to regrow in a single attempt, Lionel cast Grand Heel again before coming to a stop. He knew he could continue, but this was enough to stabilize Xyler's situation for now. If he really did continue, he would drain his stamina and then he wouldn't be able to guarantee his own safety, let alone Xyler's. Lionel felt somewhat guilty for his current situation, so, of course he would do his best to help. Lionel propped the unconscious Xyler up, piggybacking him. Though the little mink was a bit unsatisfied with its sleeping arrangements being disrupted, it clambered up to the top of Lionel's head and made another bed for itself. With that, Lionel began to walk back, his hands clasped under Xyler's thighs. However, it was a given that those emperors wouldn't just allow him to walk back to his abode. How could they give up this opportunity? Getting over her shock, the Sister Moon sibling stepped forward. So, are you free to speak now? Chapter 379. Lionel's steps paused. He really didn't know what these people wanted to talk about. It seemed more to him that they wanted to find an excuse to do something to him. However, Lionel didn't care about any of this. He gave the Sister Moon sibling a dazzling smile. It was so genuine and light that it made her heart stop for a brief moment. My name is Lionel Morales. I am a citizen of Earth. This brand on my forehead is an unfortunate circumstance. I just got unlucky in coming here during a period of time they were monitoring for fugitives. I'm sure as citizens of Terrain, you know more about this than I do. Lionel thought to himself for another few moments. I believe that is all. Make sure to spread that far and wide. Lionel didn't speak particularly loudly, but his voice resonated, reaching the ears of all those within the square. The atmosphere seemed to freeze. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Did he say something wrong? It can't be that racism is a thing in these places. No, that shouldn't be it. Lionel saw plenty of people from other worlds coming to Terrain. If they weren't alright with such a thing, why would they make it such a big staple of their culture? The four emperors were shaken once again. Lionel was filled with too many surprises. Claiming the dream abode was already enough to shake them to the core. Having a light elemental affinity so high on top of that was enough to make them green with envy despite how well they tried to hide it. But, even compared to all of this, the name Earth seemed to shake them all the more. Feelings of jealousy, animosity, and disdain swirled in the air. This wasn't a matter of nationality or racism, as odd as it seemed to say this after describing such vitriol. Earth and terrain seemed to be on two opposing sides of the spectrum. While the common citizens had never heard of Earth, the elites of terrain all had. Terrain was reaching the end of its growth potential. Earth had an endlessly paved road before it. Terrain didn't receive the support of higher-level worlds. Earth received the support of countless. Terrain was entering a crossroads that might end their world as they once knew it, and Earth was just beginning to bud. The more one compared, the more striking the differences became. Did you just say Earth? Rainred's gaze narrowed. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Yes? Rainred's gaze narrowed even further before looking toward Anared. Is this how your Carefree family operates now? Allowing those of other worlds to partake in our resources? A slight hint of animosity hung in the air. Regardless of what side you were on, the idea of someone stealing away something that was rightfully yours wouldn't sit well with you. It only made it worse that Lionel was in the third dimension. Those who wanted to partake in the Brave City trials but weren't part of the major powers of terrain had to wait to the second phase. But, who would believe that someone in the third dimension could do this? The contrast Xyler provided was too drastic. Everyone could tell that Xyler was strong enough to become a royal at worst. Yet, he was branded as a soldier now and had no choice but to abide by the rules of a soldier. If Lionel had gone through the second phase like he was supposed to, it would have been impossible for him to become an emperor and all the more impossible for him to claim the dream abode and put them in such a passive position. Anared's gaze remained indifferent. The matters of the Carefree family are ours to deal with alone. Since when was it the turn of the Cliff's Edge Terrace to speak on our matters? And, I'm also certain that if one were to pick out a traitor to our world, it most definitely wouldn't be me. Rainred's glare froze. Clearly, he hadn't expected such pointed words from Anared. All the while, Lionel was lost in his own thoughts. If I go back and pass the trial of the second phase, my name would spread far and wide, right? Aina might hear about it. Lionel thought for a moment. With his intelligence, he could immediately see the animosity aimed toward him. And, when he noticed the glances toward Xyler on his back, he managed to put it all together himself. Just when Lionel planned on acting on this though, he paused and grinned. Hate moves more than anything else. Last I remembered, you're an emperor too, correct? Lionel looked toward Rainred with a childishly innocent gaze. If you want my abode, go claim it. Suddenly, Lionel's warm smiling face became extremely punchable. In fact, I think I'm in the mood to claim more abodes. I'll be taking over the star, light and darkness abode. After I do, you can feel free to challenge any one of them. Lionel pondered on something for a moment. Now that I think about it, don't you also get some benefits for challenging an abode in enemy territory? You should want to, too. Right? Lionel's smile never faded despite sensing the animosity in the air. Anared's brows furrowed, not quite understanding what Lionel was trying to do. Was he really just so arrogant? You don't believe me? Lionel blinked innocently. The crowd was riled up. They wanted to see nothing more than Lionel falling flat on his face. But, at the same time, they wanted to beat him up where he stood. The conflicting feelings left them feeling so stifled that several almost coughed up blood. Just as Lionel was about to boldly lead everyone to the elite abodes, the city shook once again. Everyone's gaze shot toward the northern gates as they blasted open, causing the whole city to quake. As though this was a catalyst, the central tower flickered. A mass of energy converged toward the peak of the tower. At first, the form they took was blurry, but it soon became a row of numbers that read, 9:23:59:59. A countdown to the third phase had begun. In that moment, the suffocating aura around Brave City began to slowly weaken and anxious soon-to-be spectators excitedly stood. It seemed that the true trials would be starting soon. Chapter 380. Lionel placed Xyler down on a bed within his dream abode. His gaze flashed with a cold light. If it hadn't been for Sil's elder brother, he probably would have had to find his way out of that encirclement. If it was because of his own words, Lionel wouldn't mind. Plus, since he dared to step out of this abode, he also had adequate preparations at the ready. However, Lionel knew that it wasn't so simple. All along the way, the Sister Moon sibling was steering the crowd with her words. She was quite a dangerous woman indeed. In the end, it was due to the commotion at the northern gate and Lionel's own sharpness that Rain Red and the twins could only leave without accomplishing much of anything. It seemed that the start of the third phase was unlike the first two. Whoever it was who opened the northern gates was definitely a future calamity they needed to prepare for. As difficult as it was to become an emperor during the first phase, it was tens of times more difficult to do so during the second phase. In addition, this person was a true fourth-dimensional entity unlike Lionel who had only broken through in one aspect. So, compared to the danger Lionel posed, this person was a much greater threat. There's not much time left. I hear the third phase has spectators, hopefully Aina is among them. Lionel's coldness vanished into a genuine smile. During Lionel's life, Aina had only come to watch him play football once. The fact she went at all was definitely a big change for her. Usually, she avoided events like that like the plague. Just the simple action alone warmed Lionel's heart. Truthfully, back then, all the events that happened left him so shell-shocked that he forgot that simple fact. That was right, she had come to watch him. Lionel's smile became a grin. To anyone observing from afar, he looked like a love-struck fool. Hey little guy. Lionel scooped the little mink off the top of his head, stroking the little one's soft fur. I know you've wanted to go to that abode for a long time. Go ahead and break through. Little Blackstar sat up excitedly and suddenly vanished from Lionel's arms. Lionel chuckled. If that little guy really managed to break through, who knew how much trouble he'd get into? When Lionel met Little Blackstar, the little mink was an elite S-grade threat. They had done a lot of growing together since then. Though Lionel wasn't exactly sure how the cultivation of beasts worked, he trusted the little guy could make his own way forward. This was the advantage the universe gave to beasts, anyway. Lionel took a deep breath and casted a few more, Grand Heal, S on Xyler. Regrowing a limb was definitely much more difficult than he had thought it would be, and that was even with his vastly improved, Grand Heal. Of course, part of the reason was because Xyler was in the fourth dimension. But, luckily, it was just a foot and not his entire leg that had been taken out. Leo. Let me in. At that moment, Lionel suddenly heard a distant voice. He cast a glance out of the window to find Jirak yelling at him from hundreds of meters away. It was clear the bald young man was still too scared to approach the dream abode of his own accord. Lionel allowed Xyler to continue resting before letting Jirak in. He too had some questions to ask the Black family heir. Did you hear? An emperor of the second phase appeared. That hasn't happened before. Jirak boisterously strolled in, his face filled with awe. The third phase is probably going to be wild. I didn't participate last time, but am definitely going to make a name for myself this time around. Jirak. Lionel cut the young heir off before he could continue his spiel. Seemingly sensing Lionel's seriousness, Jirak frowned and turned back. What is it? Lionel looked toward Jirak deeply, causing the latter to feel no small amount of discomfort. What do you think of Earth? Lionel suddenly spoke. Ah. Jirak froze, clearly not expecting this line of questioning. His eyes darted around as though trying to find a crutch to lean on, maybe a joke to ease the mood, but all he found was bland, neatly ordered black and white furniture. Lionel's eyes narrowed. It seemed he was right. There was definitely more to this. Tell me. Lionel pressed. Lionel frowned. After a while he shook his head. If you don't want to answer, that's fine. Lionel turned and walked away. But, he never made a move to close the door to the abode he had just let Jirak through. His meaning was quite clear. Someone who signed their life away should act as such. If Jirak was unwilling to act as he should, then that only mean he didn't take this matter as seriously as Lionel once thought. And, since he didn't, that meant his character wasn't as Lionel previously deduced either. Lionel could tell that whatever Jirak knew was quite important. In fact, it should be to the point that he valued this information even more than his own life. That was fine. Lionel never planned to kill him in the first place, but he had already had one person who placed certain things above their friendship with him before. And, in such a dangerous place, within an unknown world, Lionel didn't feel like putting his life in the hands of another such person again. Jirak stood stunned, not quite knowing what to do. He, quite frankly, felt like a bride that had been abandoned at the altar. Such a joke would be enough to make him laugh at any other time, but he didn't find it funny in the least right now. As Jirak was hesitating, he suddenly felt his mind growing hazy. He immediately realized that this was the dream force beginning to encroach on his consciousness. Whatever protections Lionel had left for him were beginning to vanish. In a slight panic, Jirak quickly left through the door, a slight discomfort in his chest. This time, he had 2 reasons he didn't dare to look back toward that abode. Chapter 381. Lionel didn't spare any more thoughts toward Jirak. He didn't feel that it was a shame, nor did he feel any sense of self-pity. He was already focusing on another task already. This was just the kind of person Lionel was. At most, Lionel was now certain that there was something important about his home world he needed to find out on this planet. Though he didn't know exactly what it was, he would be able to find out. But, first, Lionel locked himself into the same top-floor room of his abode. He split one portion of his mind to monitor Zyler's situation and another to make sure that the little mink was all right, then he prepared to enter the lab setting. Just as he was doing so, his lip curled as he sensed a fiery pillar of darkness shoot into the skies as the little mink claimed an abode of his own. Of course, this was done through the little guy's connection with Lionel. So, technically, it was Lionel claiming another. But, it brought a smile to Lionel's face regardless before he once again became serious. He didn't care about what commotion this would cause, he had something much more important in mind. Now that he had broken into the 4th dimension with his spirit pressure, he could search Aeliard's mind without worrying about the consequences. Lionel entered the lab setting and brought out the snow globe that held Aeliard. With a thought, the mental mage appeared, still shackled by illusory chains. Aeliard coughed violently, his gaze showing hints of confusion as he looked around. When he looked up and saw Lionel standing above him, a hint of rage and trepidation could be seen in his eyes. Over this period of time, Lionel had been allowing the suspended animation ability of the segmented cube to slowly heal Aeliard. So, compared to the manic state the mental mage had been in before, he was much better now. Of course, Lionel had no idea how rare treasures that could heal mental injuries were. If he did, he would know that he had taken the segmented cube for granted once more. That said, Lionel hadn't done this for Aeliard's sake but rather his own. The more whole Aeliard's memories were, the easier things would be on him. If he was picking through memory fragments, it would be a pain and maybe even difficult to piece together the true story. Lionel didn't spare any words for Aeliard. He found it to be a waste of his time. So, without hesitation, he activated Mind Search. Aeliard's eyes widened before a sinister light shone in his eyes. He thought that Lionel was foolish trying to use such a technique on a mental mage like him. He almost salivated at the thought of turning Lionel into a mindless slave. But, when he felt the strength of Lionel's spirit pressure, he paled. How was this the strength of someone in the 3rd dimension? It was impossible. It was then he thought of a shocking possibility. It can't be. You can't have. Aeliard knew things that the others of Camelot had not. After all, he wasn't a part of the original legend, he had been sent in by his organization to infiltrate and capture the core treasure. But, it was precisely because of this that he was shocked. Everyone knew that it was impossible to break into the 4th dimension with the mind unless the body was strong enough. Doing so without a solid foundation would lead to one imploding in on themselves. Yet, Lionel's body was definitely still within the 3rd dimension. In addition, the force that circulated his body was also considered to be within the third. It shouldn't have been possible to do this unless Lionel had an ability or a lineage factor that allowed him to circumvent these rules. Unfortunately for Aeliard, Lionel had not just one of these things, but both. Aeliard fell into despair as he felt his memories being eaten away at. No matter how hard he fought back, Lionel's mind was like a violent swarm. Mind search was a truly sinister technique. A more accurate title would most definitely be mind swallow. To say that one was searching was completely inaccurate. The truth of what Lionel was doing was ingesting all the memories that were useful to him and discarding all those that weren't. Due to the style of the technique, Lionel had to build a bridge between his mind and Aeliard's. This meant that when he found a memory to be useless, rather than it remaining with Aeliard, it dissipated along the bridge, leaving Aeliard with nothing. If the two of their minds had been of similar strength, this bridge would cause a tug of war to erupt. However, Lionel's mind was so much stronger than Aeliard's that it was nothing but child's play. Aeliard's helplessness soon became dullness, then was replaced by a complete vacancy as he fell over, drool leaking from the side of his mouth. Lionel didn't spare the brain-dead man a single glance. He closed his eyes, organizing and sifting through everything he had just learned. The first thing he realized was that Aeliard didn't know much. However, this much was to be expected. He should have been fairly low on the totem pole. Still, for an organization that just expected Lionel to hand over all evidence of their crimes, they didn't take many precautions either. Finally, Lionel learned of the name of the organization he was dealing with. The name that so many avoided speaking of. Shield Cross Stars. It was only now Lionel understood how unlucky he was. This so-called Shield Cross Stars organization was actually a police force of the universe. Its duty was to protect the safety and humanitarian rights of beasts and humanoids across the worlds. The main issue here was that Lionel had never expected that the same organization he had slighted by not handing in evidence of their wrongdoing was the very same organization that happened to brand him as a fugitive worth monitoring. Was it just a coincidence? Or had they targeted him on purpose? From Lionel's analysis, he was fairly certain that it truly was a coincidence. But, if he was correct, just how unlucky was he? Now, an organization that had it out for him also knew his location at all times? Fuck. Lionel stood, his jaw becoming steely. He wasn't safe here. He had to find a way back to Earth as quickly as possible. Since there wasn't a branch of SCS there just yet, it would be more difficult for them to cause problems for him. The issue was, how? Entering another zone would be difficult. Using teleportation platforms was probably another no-go. They'll find Aina first then think of what to do. Lionel sighed. He felt as though a guillotine was hanging over his head. However, at least he was aware of its existence now. Not only this, but he had become aware of many other things. The days quickly flew by. Soon, Lionel would have no choice but to join everyone else within the central tower. That morning, with just a few hours left until the timer would hit 0, a shadowy figure slowly stalked toward the central tower. A prominent hunched back was the first thing anyone caught sight of. As for the rest, it was shrouded in black. By now, everyone knew that this was the sword monstress, the very woman who caused the commotion at the northern gate. Chapter 382. The sword mantra's steps were light. It was almost impossible to accept that her figure was so large yet so nimble. From the third phase onward, all of the trials would begin with the central tower as the centerpiece. As a result, the population of people flowing into it was quite large to begin with. So, it was no surprise that such an odd figure stood out right from the very beginning. Of course, there was no lack of odd individuals. However, from the very beginning, most eyes had been focused toward the northern sector's entry gates. For such a figure to come from this specific region immediately caught the attention of many. Despite the fact those tasked with observing the northern sector had their own speculations, they didn't dare to confirm it themselves. If they were correct, this person was the only emperor to be birthed from the second phase since Brave City appeared on terrain. This wasn't a person they could afford to offend. Though they couldn't see what was beneath the hood, this only made this person more fear-inducing. They didn't want to get mixed up in anything far beyond themselves and lose their lives for a ridiculous reason. Like this, several backed off after the sword monstress appeared, rushing off to their superiors with their conjectures. The sword monstress continued to walk forward as though nothing had changed. The central tower was one of many floors and was the only structure in Brave City that could rival the walls in height. At the same time, it was also an incredibly wide structure despite the fact it was definitely much taller than it was so. This design left one feeling as though one had stepped into an all-new world after entering just the first floor. The first floor of the tower was expansive and incredibly bland. It acted as nothing more than a conduit to help the flow of people reach the places they wanted to go. There were no stairs nor any elevators like one would see on Earth. Rather, there were elevated paths with queues of people. Each had a miniature teleportation station that would take one to a given floor. During the first and second phase, the tower was nothing more than a restaurant. With enough status, one could reach the top floor and gain access to delicacies the likes of which the world of terrain rarely saw. It was unfortunate that Lionel wasn't aware of this, or he may very well have taken advantage. He had long since become tired of his usual bland diet of meat and more meat. Of course, this was also mostly due to his own laziness. He had obtained many delicious fruits and vegetables from the underground garden he found within the hive. But he kept them all within the snow globes rather than properly fostering them. After all, he was a force crafter, not a gardener. At this moment, though, not a single person was traveling to higher floors. Even if one wanted to, the teleportation pads were out of commission. Those who were aware of the changes that happened as the third phase approached weren't surprised. This was simply the tower preparing itself for its true purpose. Hey, are you the Emperor from the northern sector? Let me see the brand on your forehead. The once bustling tower suddenly fell into silence. The voice that had called out was booming. It had enough forcefulness to it to directly suppress the voices of everyone else. Of course, this was because no one else was trying to speak over the crowd at the same time, or else this matter wouldn't have been so easy. Everyone's attention oscillated between the emperor who had spoken and the black figure that had been targeted. There were very few emperors in Brave City to begin with. So, everyone immediately recognized the original speaker as Wheeless Mirage, the young heir to the Mirage Pavilion. He had a rotund body, yet his charms were also somewhat feminine. Of course, the red robes accented with violet soft armor didn't help him escape this image very well. It couldn't be helped. The heir to the Mirage Pavilion was rarely a man. In fact, this was only the second time in their history that such a thing had happened. This said, no one looked down on this chubby, feminine man. So, when the black figure didn't bother to respond, the tension in the air grew palpable. Wheeless' gaze narrowed. His cheeks squeezed, almost covering his eyes completely. Wheeless suddenly chuckled, his body moving forward slowly. Rainred and Jilnia, who had been by his side, didn't say anything as they watched him. The third phase had yet to begin, so they were still under the rules of the second phase. There was no rules against battle outside of trials just yet. In addition, even if there were, they would still support Wheeless' actions at this moment. The best way to learn about such a mysterious figure would be to test them personally. As heirs to powers, they didn't believe that some unknown could be better than them. In their minds, if they were born from lesser families and didn't receive quotas, they too could become emperors through the second phase. Whether that was actually true or not was still up for debate. But, all that mattered was that they believed it. The shadowy figure didn't move in the slightest. Her hulking figure seemed unperturbed by Wheeless' looming threat, even as the young heir's footsteps echoed through the floor. In a corner, Syl and Anared watched on in silence. They didn't have any particular horse in this race, so they too were just spectating just like everyone else. Big brother, do you recognize that person? Anared's gaze narrowed slightly, but in the end he shook his head. No. I don't. Syl's lovely eyes blinked with an innocent curiosity. It seemed that the legend of the sword monstress hadn't spread very wide just yet. But this made quite some sense. After all, one of the reasons the sword monstress was able to make it here was because the influx of people migrating toward Brave City made it difficult to pick out individuals. At that moment, Willis made it to within 3 meters of the shadowy figure before stopping. If before everyone was already avoiding this person, they were now giving the figure an even wider berth. No one had any interest in getting caught up in this drama. Chapter 383. Willis opened his mouth to speak once more, but, bang! A heavy sword swung from the sword monstress back, landing on the stone's grounds of the tower's floors. Despite the heft of the sword, not a single mark was left behind. But no one doubted the strength of the sword monstress due to this. The broad sword vibrated wildly upon impact as though looking to launch itself out from the hands of the sword monstress as she faced Willis. When the sword appeared, Jianghu's gaze narrowed. Willis stood just under 3 meters before the sword monstress. But, due to the outrageous length of the massive sword, it clanged before him, just a mere foot or two away. In fact, it seemed to be aimed between his legs, leaving him feeling a slight chill. However, what Willis felt wasn't fear. The process had been slow enough for him to witness the start to the end without issue. To a warrior on his level, it hadn't been a problem to see it all. The issue was that, his heart still felt a slight trepidation. It was a warning. Willis, though, had every intention of lashing out. Not only was it important for them to know the limits of this figure, but it was also a matter of his face. Where would he put it if he were to back off now? Especially since he was the one who started all of this. It seems that. Just when Willis wanted to say more, he suddenly sensed a figure appear by his side. The contrast between this figure and the hulking, black-robed figure before them was too striking. Jianghu was a goddess in the eyes of many. She had a small, soft waist, flowing black hair, and a flawless complexion that seemed sculpted by the hands of a master. Though she was lacking in comparison to Era, this seemed to be due to lack of a mature and refined temperament rather than a shortcoming of her own looks. All of this alone would have been enough to capture many hearts. But, the way her white robes hung to her curves captured the soul. And, whether by design or coincidence, the way her sky-blue soft armor cupped her chest and accentuated her slender legs only made more imaginations run wild. The moment she appeared, most directly forgot about Willis and what he had been planning to do. To them, there was no better entertainment than a beauty, even if she only stood there and did nothing else. In a corner to his own, having reunited with the members of his Black City, Jianghu was enthralled. He only barely managed to stop himself from whistling. It was fine if he teased a weak woman, but if he teased someone like Jianghu, well, let's just say he didn't have any fantasies of being castrated anytime soon. What are you doing? Jianghu all but ignored Willis. But, it was difficult to get angry at a beauty, so Willis only shook his head and let her do as she pleased. That sword. Jianghu said coldly, looking from the tip of the blade that reverberated against the ground to the shadowy figure. I received reports from my subordinate cities that several massacres had occurred. The perpetrator was a woman with a hunched back, dressed in black robes, and wielding a great sword. That was you? A shocked silence overcame everyone. The first thing that caught them by surprise was the word woman. It was hard to connect the hulking figure before them with the fairer sex. But, after that sunk in, they recognized the word massacre. You mean to tell them that someone actually slaughtered their way through World's End Falls territory? And even dared to come to Brave City right afterward? They couldn't decide whether this person was brave or just stupid. At this point, it didn't even matter whether Jianghu's words were true or not. When it came to matters like this, whoever held the most strength would be the one in the right. And, it seemed now that not only had this sword monstress angered Willis with her disregard, but she had also enraged Jianghu by slighting the power behind her. No matter how others looked at it, this would end incredibly badly for this cloaked figure. Still, despite the young heiress' pointed questions, the sword monstress still didn't respond. The reverberations of her sword sung through the tower's first floor as though acting as her reply. If you're dissatisfied, just come, it seemed to say. At that very moment, Lionel stood before the dark abode, shaking his head. He turned his head toward the looming numbers in the distance and sighed again. 0:0:8:39. Considering his location, it wouldn't take him long to get to the central tower. But, he still felt uncomfortable cutting it so close. He wasn't sure if there would be a penalty for being late. But, considering his current situation, he didn't dare to test it out. He felt that if there was a timer, there was a reason for it being there. Now, whether that was true or not, once again, he was unsure. But, better safe than sorry. He was a bit regretful that he had allowed the little mink to enter on his own now. Unfortunately, Lionel had forgotten that the first time he watched the little mink evolve, the little guy had fallen into a deep sleep for several days. This was likely happening again. Forget it. It will take me 2 minutes and 21 seconds to make it from here to the tower at full speed. I'll wait until 0:0:2:30 is left on the clock, then. Lionel felt that the little mink should be fine within the abode. From what he knew, there was no one else capable of claiming a dark abode. And, even if there were, they would all be taking part in the third phase. So, everything should be fine. Just when Lionel had made this decision, a black blur suddenly shot out from the house and barreled right into his chest. The streak was so quick that due to Lionel's absent-mindedness, he didn't even notice what happened until it was too late. Oof. Lionel coughed, feeling his ribs rebound against his heart and lungs. After a while, he laughed, looking at the bundle of fur in his arms. Were you trying to kill me or something? Lionel chuckled. Yip. Yip. Lionel's lip twitched. Why does that sound like a yes? The little mink ignored Lionel's words and crawled to his favorite spot around his neck. Fine, fine. You win. All right, let's go. Chapter 384. Jianghu's eyes narrowed. You overestimate yourself. What happened next was so sudden that no one could have expected it. It was hard to imagine that beauty who elicited the feeling of care and protection in them all would suddenly surge forward and attack without warning. In one instant, Jianghu was like a delicate flower in a vase. In the next, she was a pouncing panther, her slender legs exploding with undeniable power and strength. The sword monstress responded as quickly as it seemed humanly possible, raising her sword like a shield across her body. Jianghu's palm shot forward like a venomous serpent, slamming against the spine of the great sword. Bang! The sword monstress body convulsed. It was just a single palm, but it felt as though she had been hit 3 times continuously. A surge of concentric wind ricocheted off the side of her sword, sending her sliding across the ground. Jianghu didn't seem intent on stopping, her beautiful eyes remaining indifferent as she shot forward again. Her movements gave one the illusion of rushing water. It had an undeniable forcefulness, but also hid a fluidity and flexibility that accentuated the curves of a woman. Bang! A second palm descended. This one was several times stronger than the previous. Rather than carrying 3 layered strikes, this one carried 4. This time, the sword monstress lost her footing. Unable to slide along the ground anymore, she stumbled backward and got tossed off her feet. Jianghu's attack was relentless. Any veteran of battle knew that whoever gained an initiative would hold an upper hand. If one managed to keep this advantage, victory would only be a matter of time. However, it soon became very clear that Jianghu didn't need the initiative to claim victory. Whether it was speed, strength, or ability, she surpassed this cloaked figure by not just a single level. This left those watching baffled. They had thought that this cloaked figure would have a high level of skill after daring to offend 2 heirs. Yet, it seemed that when comparing whether this woman was brave or foolish, it was most likely the latter. Willis felt his anger dissipate. What a waste of emotions. He couldn't believe he wasted time getting angry at a person so far beneath him. It seems that Jianghu gained an inkling of comprehension toward her false style. Couple that with her ability and she truly would be too troublesome to deal with. Every time Jianghu attacked, it was as though 3, 4, 5, and sometimes even 6 of her were assaulting the same person all at the same time. Her heart couldn't help but be filled with disdain. Just die, she thought coldly. She didn't know who this person was, but she had truly never met anyone more foolish. Thanks to the times, this sword monstress had already been lucky enough to escape the clutches of her power. Yet, instead of accepting this bout of good fortune, she actually dove right back into the lion's den. Jianghu's palm shot toward the sword monstress' head. The air around her palm trembled. If one looked closely, it seemed as though her strike was being superimposed. A portion reflected where her palm would be, a portion reflected where it was now, and the last reflected where it had been. These attacks came together as one, causing the air to quake. Had this strike been sent out in a third-dimensional world, there was no doubt that the clap of the sound barrier shattering would have sounded. It was at that moment when Jianghu's palm was just moments away from collapsing the sword monstress' head in on itself that things suddenly changed. The sword monstress aura surged. A sinister, dark and bloodthirsty air erupted. From beneath the hooded cloak, one could see 2 eyes blazing with a blinding gold light that flickered with a deep darkness. The sword monstress swung her great sword to meet Jianghu's palm. Bang! The sword monstress took several steps back before stabilizing herself while Jianghu took just one. But, without hesitation, the sword monstress shot forward again, her great sword trailing to her back like the tail of a comet. She brought her sword forward in a great arc, leaving a blur in the air. Bang! Jianghu forced the sword monstress back again, her expression filled with rage. It was as though she couldn't believe that this beast of a woman would dare fight back against her. The spectators remained silent as though scared to get involved in such a thing. They too hadn't expected the sword monstress to suddenly fight back, but the truth was that it didn't seem to matter. However, those who were clever among them seemed to realize that maybe the sword monstress wasn't as foolish as she seemed. By now, there was already less than 5 minutes before the timer struck 0. By feigning an inability to fight back at all in the beginning, she managed to drag out the battle. It was only after it seemed she really might die that she really started to fight. If things went on like this, there was no way Jianghu would be able to kill her before the timer rang out. And, when the third phase began, all the rules would change. Most intelligent people seemed to realize this. But, it was difficult to calmly analyze things in the heat of battle, especially when you were enraged like Jianghu. As for why Wheeless and Rainred hadn't explained this to Jianghu, there were 2 reasons. For one, if someone had to explain this to her, Jianghu would only lose more face. And, secondly, after seeing the sword monstress combat power, they no longer feared her. They didn't care whether she died or not, it would hardly change anything. This was the same reason they had for not pressing forward to kill Lionel. His impact on the coming trials would be limited. Bang! The sword monstress slid back once again. But, this time, Jianghu didn't pursue. So that's your plot? The beautiful heiress looked toward the ticking time, visible anger twisting her delicate features. Unfortunately for you, you've still underestimated me. At that moment, many touched their ears, not believing what they were hearing. Where was this sound of rushing water coming from? Chapter 385. Jianghu brandished her palms in a composed stance, her gaze cold. Just like there were weapons forces, there were likewise forces for various bodily martial arts. Fist force, palm force, various kicking and leg forces, they all existed. However, just like weapon forces, these bodily martial art forces didn't have anything particularly special to them other than a slight boost in strength. When Lionel comprehended his spear force, it was a product of the spear consciousnesses he observed within spear domain. He was able to constantly build on this spear force, refining it and perfecting it. Despite the fact Lionel's spear force was still just an empty shell right now, it was still far more powerful than it had been in the past. In the same way, bodily forces had to be refined over time. Only in this way could they manifest true strength. The so-called false style was a martial arts discipline of the world's end false power. It emphasized a steady, unrelenting flow. Every attack flowed into the next. Upon gaining an initiative with this style, it was impossible to lose it. Had it not been for Jianghu choosing to take a step back now, the sword monstress would still be on her back foot. If Lionel had been here, he would realize that this so-called style was exactly the discipline he had been learning through the stone monuments. For the false style, only upon reaching a high level of comprehension would one hear the sound of rushing waters. It was clear that not only had Jianghu begun to grasp her power's core teachings, but she was well on her way to mastering them. Jianghu knew well just how suited this style was to her. Her ability was shockingly and exceptionally rare time affinity ability that allowed her to layer her attacks. It made a single attack feel like many, giving her great offensive prowess. Unfortunately, among time affinity abilities, hers was ranked so near the bottom that she couldn't even dream of claiming the time abode. The first time she came to Brave City, she foolishly overestimated herself and almost lost her life in the attempt. In fact, she was still suffering from the loss of over 10 years from her lifespan. However, this didn't mean that her ability was weak. In fact, when coupled with the false style, she was likely the strongest amongst herself, Rain Red and Wheeless. Knowing this, when she saw the enemy of her power before her, a fiery anger bubbled up within her heart. She was the strongest. How could she possibly allow such a plan to succeed? Die. Jianghu shot forward again. But, this time, her speed seemed to have almost doubled, her palms raining down like the judgment of a god from above. Bang! 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 The sword monstress was hardly able to block, but her success only pissed Jianghu off more. Jianghu's gaze flashed with a hint of red. By now, the sound of rushing water reached a peak. It was as though they were all standing at the base of an impossibly vast waterfall, falling with such strength that it shattered the rocks at its base into powder. Jianghu's next strike was so fast that it bypassed the defense of the sword monstress' great sword and shot right toward her head. The glow of two eyes flickered beneath the hood. With an inhuman reaction speed, the sword monstress curled her head away. However, the air pressure grazed her shoulder, causing her body to twirl backward. Bang! The sword monstress shot tens of meters backward, crashing into the walls of the tower. All those standing in the area shot away, unwilling to get in Jianghu's way. The sound of dripping blood sounded once the tower fell into another silence. At that moment, everyone saw the same thing. The side of the sword monstress cloak was torn away, revealing a now bloodied shoulder. However, what was the most shocking was that this sword monstress' so-called hunched back was actually a massive, oddly curved package larger than even the sword monstress herself. With much of the cloak ripped away, it was easier to estimate the sword monstress' true size. In fact, she looked like quite a petite young lady. And with the way her black hair fell over her face, she even seemed somewhat enticing. However, those thoughts of curiosity all vanished when the sword monstress raised her head. In all their years, they had never seen such a grotesque sight. A ghastly infection ran across her face like the trenches of a muddy war. The scars were so inflamed that they even somewhat covered the portions of her face that hadn't been run across by them. Colors of green, purple and even gross brown ran across them all. It all reflected beneath the light in a way that made the skin of all those who saw it crawl. "It's you." Jianghu's gaze blazed. The sword monstress used her sword as a crutch and pushed herself up. Under the gazes of everyone present, the wound to her shoulder rapidly healed. In the blink of an eye, other than the blood that still ran over her skin, it seemed as though she had never been injured at all. Jianghu's pupils constricted. She remembered this ability, but it was even more potent than it had been in the past. Unfortunately, it wouldn't matter. A dead person couldn't heal. The sword monstress walked forward with an indifferent expression. The cloak she wore had nothing to do with a will to hide her face. If it was about this, she would wear a mask instead. Rather, the cloak was a convenient way to hide the curved box on her back. This was what she wanted to hide. But, since it was out in the open already, it didn't matter much anymore. Since she had already made it to Brave City and the third phase was about to begin, keeping it hidden no longer mattered. Jianghu's gaze flashed with a cold light. At that moment, though, a person suddenly rushed into the tower's first floor. In such a silent environment, especially when everyone had already arrived early, such an arrival caught the attention of many. Even Jianghu couldn't help but spare a glance. A young man with handsome and sharp features shot inside, a wide grin on his face when he noticed the time hadn't quite hit 0 just yet. The young man seemed to be in a great mood. But, with his sharp senses, he seemed to realize that something was off about the atmosphere. After scanning the area, his gaze landed on 2 young women. The young man's eyes widened. Aina. The young man's expression suddenly changed. Any words he was going to say were cut off, his mind going blank. Those who spoke about the details of this day in the future would remember it as the day they felt the most fear they ever had in their lifetimes. Each and every person present felt as though their hearts had been gripped by a reaper, like bone-cold waters had been poured into their veins, traveling through their bodies and leaving them completely paralyzed. Out of her own control, Jianghu's body shot backward at the fastest speed she could muster, her heart thumping so hard that it felt like it might fly from her chest at any moment. The young man vanished, appearing before the sword monstress in the blink of an eye. Only a rare few could even see how he moved, and even those who could felt as though he had become nothing but a streak of gold light. He stood before the sword monstress, his eyes blazing. In that instant, several collapsed to the ground, their visions turning black. The pressure was so suffocating that even many who managed to maintain their consciousness fell to their knees, tears of fear falling from their eyes. Who did this to you? I'll kill them all. A palpable aura surged out like a sea of blood, enveloping the tower's first floor. The young man's voice boomed, causing the air to quake and tremble beneath his rage. For the first time, there was a ripple in the sword monstress' gaze. Chapter 386. Lionel had never felt so much anger before. He didn't even think about how it was he recognized Aina at all. Lionel had known for a long time that the face he had come to know wasn't Aina's own. He never once thought of asking her why that was. To him, it simply didn't matter. But, after finding out the truth, his blood boiled and seethed. He didn't care about what Aina looked like. Even back when he chose her over so many others and hadn't known about her face coverings, she had never been the most beautiful. He simply went with his gut feeling and accepted it. But now, knowing that someone had done something like this to her, Lionel's visceral reaction was even more violent than it had been when he found out someone had cut something out of him as a mere child. As for Aina, the last thing she had expected was to meet Lionel here. Despite the effort Lionel had put into spreading his name, she had practically cut off contact with the outside world while she was on the run. Where would she have had the time to converse and learn about the hottest rumors? However, it was precisely because she was so caught off guard that her gaze rippled so violently. Something about Lionel's reaction shook her to her core. After she came to this world, she had hoped to forget everything else. In fact, part of the reason she chose to take off her face covering was as a way of leaving those things of the past in the past. This scarred face of hers looked nothing like the face Lionel knew. Even if these scars suddenly vanished, she would look like a completely different person. She had thought that even if she ran into Lionel, there was no way he would recognize her. But, she could have never expected that not only would he, but that he would do so quickly. It was almost surreal. As if that wasn't enough to shake her, of all the reactions she expected to find in his gaze, she saw none of them. There was no disgust, there was no hesitancy, there wasn't even a shred of pity. There was nothing but rage. Lionel saw red. He was so focused on Aina's face that he hadn't even realized she had been in battle. When he looked down at her shoulder and saw the yet-to-dry blood dripping down from her already healed wound, his gaze became steely. Lionel's head turned to Jianghu, his irises flickering with wild violet-red lights. You did this? Clearly, this time, Lionel was no longer referring to Aina's scars. Who gave you the guts? Jianghu trembled. She didn't know why she was feeling such fear. Wasn't this the same third-dimensional breath they hadn't taken seriously? Where was all this pressure coming from? It felt as though a hand was constricting her throat, limiting her breathing. Lionel's palm flipped over, a dense black bow appearing. Sharp winds kicked up. A fluid conception of a wild blizzard shook the air, wrapping around Lionel and Aina. Whether by design or because Aina was simply the only one who never seemed to feel any pressure from Lionel, she stood by silently, her gaze still flickering with a dense swath of emotions. Die. Lionel spoke the same word Xianxia had. But somehow, it felt like the true call of the Reaper. Compared to the latter's version, it seemed like a command, an unquestionable call from the depths of hell. An arrow whirled to life, forming from the energies of the world. A little mink bared its fangs from around Lionel's neck, its little body growing a size as its fur stood on end. A thick black shadow drifted from its body and surrounded Lionel's body. And, at that moment, shing! 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 Lionel's force suddenly gained a sharp characteristic. It felt as though he could tear through anything, as though no obstacle could block his path. Xianxia felt in those moments that no matter how she dodged, nothing would come of it. Lionel's sharp gaze locked onto her, a cold murderous intent manifesting around his body. His hair whipped about wildly, his back standing tall and straight as it flexed with all its might. Even through the thickness of his black robes, one could feel the fullness of his figure. Shoo! Lionel's fingers left his bowstring. For an instant, it felt as though everyone was thrust into a land of ice and snow, watching as a relentless hail descended from above. Xianxia felt too much fear to even move. She was locked down by a style far beyond her false martial arts. It was like her every instinct had been accounted for, like even if she dodged it would only be like jumping into the arms of death. It was a feeling she would never forget in her life. She knew she had more strength than this, more power than maybe this attack even had to offer. But, for some reason, she didn't dare to use it. It was as though a higher power had commanded her to accept her death. And, before this power, she was nothing. But, 0:0:0:0 ding. An energy swirled around the tower's first floor, snuffing everything out. Even Lionel's arrow vanished into thin air. The moment the clock hit 0, a central platform elevated from the center of the first floor and a teleportation array flickered. Soon, 3 forms began to appear. When they manifested, the first thing everyone noticed was their odd yet valiant dressing. However, Lionel's gaze still carried a bloodthirsty air to it. All he knew was that the appearance of these 3 stopped his commandment from coming to fruition. The 3 figures had been casual. This world was definitely not as interesting as being assigned to the others, but they still had to do their jobs. Since they had been thrust into this boring situation together, they had a sense of camaraderie amongst one another. The truth was that they weren't the ones who snuffed out Lionel's attack, that was just a normal function of the tower. They had no idea that they had been wrongly accused by a kid they wouldn't normally give a second glance toward. But, when they appeared, they felt a savage, relentless aura lock onto them. Even with their strength, they couldn't help but frown and look toward the source of it. Chapter 387. For a moment it seemed that Lionel really had every intention of attacking these people. Those who knew him had expressions that widened in shock. It was one thing to attack Xianxia, but the overseers of these trials were not only outstanding talents from across the universe, but they were most definitely fifth-dimensional entities at worst. In fact, that was just their speculation from their place at the bottom of a well. For all they knew, these individuals were beyond the fifth dimension. However, judging by Lionel's posture and the fact his aura of rage hadn't dissipated in the slightest, it seemed he really did have every intention of attacking. It was at the moment he almost acted that Lionel suddenly felt something soft grasp his hand. He was so unused to the feeling that he was shocked out of his enraged state. The atmosphere seemed to become several times lighter in the blink of an eye, causing those who had forgotten to breathe to finally heave a sigh of relief. Those who had collapsed to the ground finally relaxed, their minds being released from their shackles. It was only after this happened that Xianxia suddenly understood the state she had been in. In the blink of an eye, her fear became shock, then shame, then rage. However, there was already nothing she could do. Lionel shook his head and looked down to find that Aina had grabbed onto his hand. Well, it couldn't really be described like this. More accurately, she had grasped onto 3 of his fingers as though she was scared to grab onto anything more. The sight made Lionel involuntarily chuckle. Aina frowned. What are you laughing at? Are you trying to die? This was the first time anyone had ever heard the sword monstress speak. They couldn't have ever expected for her voice to be so soft and pleasing to the ears. It was as though she was caressing their eardrums. Lionel looked into Aina's eyes curiously. Aina suddenly became self-conscious and looked away. After she had done it, she realized that she was acting out of character. It's ugly, I know. Aina didn't say these words aloud. But this was the very first time she had even thought them to herself. It was a surprise to her that her mind even went to such a place. These scars had been with her all her life. But they never filled her with disgust toward herself, they only filled her with rage. After the metamorphosis began and she realized how she could use them to her advantage, they even became a source of pride for her. It represented her resilience and her hard work. For all these reasons, she couldn't believe what she had just breathed to life in her thoughts. She had never been such a person. It was the Brazinger family, right? Lionel's smile vanished once again, his expression hardening. Aina froze for a moment, but didn't look back toward Lionel. Good. Lionel looked away. I'll make certain to raise them to the ground, then. Aina remained silent and slowly let go of Lionel's fingers. From the distance, Anared watched this with a frown. After regaining his bearings from Lionel's previous outburst, he began to calmly analyze the situation. And, quite frankly, he didn't like what he was seeing. However, Lionel wasn't paying attention to this anymore. He continued to stand by Aina's side, he wasn't going to let her out of his sight again. Everything else that happened from this point on no longer mattered much to him. The first reason he had agreed to join the Carefree family's quota was in order to find a path toward finding Aina. Beyond that, the only reason he had tried to stand out so much was also for this reason. Now, as far as Lionel was concerned, nothing else was quite so important. Of course, he would still do his part to repay the Carefree family for their role in helping him find Aina. That was the least he could do, anyway. The 3 figures on the platform looked toward Lionel with a frown, wondering where such pressure came from. How could they bother to care about drama between kids? As a result, they had no idea what had happened here previously. But, looking at the sorry state most were in, they felt it had something to do with this young man. Their gazes unconsciously shifted toward the young woman by his side. By now, Aina had regained her bearing and stood there silently. Though she had let go of Lionel's hand, she at least didn't move away from him. In Lionel's book, that much was a plus. The 3 figures were much more experienced than the others here. While these kids only saw ugly, infected scars, they saw a curse. They raised their eyebrows. The only female among the 3 looked toward Aina with a gratified gaze. She had no idea who Aina was before this moment, but just the simple act of Aina standing before them all completely maskless left her feeling somewhat in awe and a bit protective of this young girl. Any anger she felt toward Lionel unleashing killing intent toward them was already forgotten. As they were observing Lionel and Aina, Lionel, too, was observing them. Their uniforms are also cool. Lionel couldn't help but think. He really hoped this wasn't a pattern. If he had to gain enmity with another organization with cool uniforms, it would be too depressing. At first, it looked as though all 3 of them, whether male or female, were all wearing skirts. But, upon closer inspection, Lionel realized that this wasn't the case. The first thing Lionel thought when he realized the truth was Aladdin's pants. Lionel smiled, remembering the cartoons his father had introduced him to as a child. The uniforms of these 3 all involved the same harem pants Aladdin wore. The mid-sections of these pants swept so close to the floor that some could mistake them for skirts without looking closely. All of their harem pants were a pristine white. In addition, they each had cloth waist belts of a deep black. This cloth wrapped around their waists and then dropped vertically to the ground between their legs. The exposed face of this cloth was inscribed with white embroidery that depicted similar war scenes to the ones that could be found on the wall of Brave City. The men were bare-chested, revealing their toned and chiseled torsos, while the woman wrapped a white cloth around her bountiful chest. However, regardless of gender, they all had vibrant neckwear reminiscent of what a pharaoh of ancient times would wear. This large neckwear was a solid block of silver that hung heavily around their shoulders and collarbone. Each and every one of them exuded a powerful aura. Without Lionel's influence, they easily became the center of attention. No, they demanded it. Chapter 388. Seeing that Lionel didn't seem to be off-put by their gazes and even seemed to be sizing them up, the three looked toward one another. Maybe this world wouldn't be as boring as they originally thought. All right. The female took the lead, stepping forward. Her voice alone grabbed all of their attention, causing them to almost forget everything else. Most of you have participated before and are aware of the process. Those who haven't, step forward. The registration process will be the same. Age, affinity, and rank will all be taken down before proceeding to the next step. The central platform flashed with a small light. When it faded, an altar had appeared before the female with a small indent within it. No one dared to test the patience of the three figures. So, those who had already participated in the past took several steps back, making way for the newbies. Among these new participants there were, of course, Lionel and Aina. But there were other easily recognizable figures. There was young Miss Swan, Sil, Jirak, and even Zyler. These four kept sweeping glances toward Lionel, but it was as though there was nothing else worth his attention after Lionel appeared. In fact, he seemed to be smiling more, leaving a curtain of warmth around him. It was hard to believe that this was the same young man that fear-inducing aura had just come from. Sil and Kyra kept looking between Lionel and Aina. As for Zyler, he had a complicated look in his eye. He still couldn't believe that Lionel had been the one to save him. Finally, Jirak didn't dare to look again after the first time. His chest still weighed heavily with guilt. The truth was that Lionel had long since forgotten about Jirak. But, maybe it was exactly this that left the latter feeling so uncomfortable. It wasn't as though the two were the best of friends, but Jirak still felt like he was losing something. But, how could his loyalty to Lionel already be greater than his loyalty to his own family? Though this sounded logical, Jirak knew the real reason he felt guilty. It was precisely because his actions were tantamount to going back on his own word. Since he said his life was now Lionel's, that should have been the end of the story. The fact he was still holding back only meant that he never took his word as seriously as he claimed to. Jirak Black. 31 years old. Medial grade 4 wind elemental affinity. Jirak took his palm away from the groove in the altar. The female nodded slightly. Jirak hesitated. Is something the matter? The female asked, slightly impatient. Jirak smiled sheepishly. Usually, this grin of his worked 4 out of 5 times on the ladies. But the female continued to glare at him, causing him to retract it just as quickly as he had deployed it. Coughing slightly, Jirak cleared his throat. What does a grade 4 affinity mean? The female didn't really want to answer. But, unfortunately, this was part of her job description. Affinity is a comparison of your skill with a type of force in comparison to your dimensional stage. The higher your affinity in comparison to your stage, the higher the score. Inferior grade 4 is the average for someone within the 4th dimension. If you had the equivalent of this affinity within the 3rd dimension, your affinity would be marked out at grade 5. A grade 5 affinity is enough to skip the preliminary rounds. Of course, What the female didn't bother to say was the fact that an inferior grade 4 evaluation was only average in terms of the standards of their organization's new recruits. On a fourth dimension world-like terrain, especially one reaching the end of its potential, grade 4 was considered to be an elite amongst elites, let alone medial grade 4. Oh, I see. Jirak stepped down feeling somewhat dejected. Kyra Snow. 29 years old. Inferior grade 4 variant water affinity. Sil Kiafur. 30 years old. Medial grade 4 empty sword embryo. Xyler Kanith. 35 years old. Quasi grade 4 empty spear embryo. Xyler calmly accepted his evaluation, his gaze still blazing with determination. For the first time, a curious glint lit in the eyes of the female. It was quite baffling, though, that this glint would appear for the worst evaluation yet. At that moment, with the start of the third phase, the audience had already chosen their seats. Of course, it was impossible for them to enter the tower. But they were now allowed to enter the city and reach the central region around the tower. There, they found a stadium of sorts where the matters occurring inside were projected out for the viewing pleasure. Unfortunately for them, due to the fact these images only appeared at the start of the third phase, these spectators had no idea what happened between Lionel and the others previously. Sister-in-law, who's that ugly girl beside that mean guy? Is he two-timing Big Sis? Ree didn't seem very happy with what she was seeing. While others were focused on the registration, she was paying attention to something completely different. Era remained silent, keeping her elegant posture. Many in the crowd couldn't help but gravitate toward her, but the banner of the Kiafur family was too strong of a barrier. Hearing Rai's words, a middle-aged man sitting beside Zimo frowned. What is this all about? This man was Sil's father, City Lord Kiafur. Hearing that his daughter was being two-timed was definitely news to him. Since when had his daughter been dating in the first place, and why didn't he know anything about it? Era smiled lightly. It's nothing, father-in-law. Ree just has an overactive imagination. Ree pouted after hearing this, but didn't go against Era. Though City Lord Kiafur raised an eyebrow, he didn't say anything more. Rai's little mental lapses were the last thing on his mind. His son needed to perform well this time. They had much more riding on this. Of course, there was someone else who needed Anna Red to perform well, and that was his very own wife. But, her reason for wanting this was very much different from her father-in-law. Do you want to go first? Lionel asked with a smile. Aina nodded lightly and walked forward, climbing to the platform and placing her delicate palm upon the altar. The female's eyes glowed. Of all those here, she was most curious about Aina's performance since she had a good impression of the young girl. But, when she read them, her eyes couldn't help but widen, her breath hitching slightly. Chapter 389. Aina Brazinger. 18 years old, these words alone caused many to freeze. An 18-year-old within the fourth dimension was completely unheard of on terrain. When they thought back to how long Aina had managed to battle with Jilnia, their hearts couldn't help but tremble. Would they have been able to do such a thing at such a young age? As surprised as those within the tower were, those spectating from the outside were even more so. Ree sat completely frozen. Even Era's brows raised, a look of curiosity on her lovely features. However, her reaction didn't seem nearly as exaggerated as that of the others around her. That said, this age was meaningless to the female. Reaching the fourth dimension at such an age couldn't be said to be amazing in her opinion. There were many who reached such a stage without even crossing into the double digits with their age. Of course, this didn't factor in the fact that the metamorphosis had only just occurred on Earth. For those as talented as Lionel and Aina, they could have reached the fourth dimension just as quickly had they been much younger when the metamorphosis occurred. Unfortunately, only those who knew they were from Earth were aware of this. However, it wasn't until now that they truly pieced together what this really meant. Earth had begun its metamorphosis barely a year ago. That meant that Lionel and Aina had gained such strength so fast. Of course, many had practiced on Earth before the metamorphosis began, and those who did included Aina. But, to practice without undergoing metamorphosis was like swimming against a vicious tide. If anything, it made their accomplishments even more impressive. Still, since the female didn't know all of this wasn't what had shocked her in the slightest. Quasi-grade 5 dark elemental affinity. Another bomb seemed to go off. To now, the highest evaluation had been medial 4th grade. To suddenly go up 2 levels was completely beyond anyone's expectation. But, maybe the most shocking part was that it wasn't a 3-level leap, it was a 3-level leap. Inferior. Medial. Superior. Perfection. Quasi. However, the female still wasn't finished. Medial grade 4 empty sword embryo. Quasi grade 5 axe embryo, Era's pupils constricted. Just one was already enough for her to sit up, but this was reaching territory where even she was beginning to feel impressed. And yet, the female still wasn't finished. Medial grade 5 life elemental affinity, Xianxia, Wheeless, and Rainred stood frozen. Of all those here, their connection with Aina was likely the most complicated. The higher Aina's talent was, the harder their hearts clenched. Is this why Aina dared to come here? Is it because she knew what would happen? Is this why she wasn't worried about them in the slightest? How rare was this life elemental force? They had never even heard of it before. At the very least, no abode had ever appeared in Brave City for it. What they didn't know was that just like the dream abode, such abodes like the life abode appeared and disappeared at will. The people of Terrain believed the dream abode appeared randomly, when the truth was that it only ever appeared when those with a small amount of affinity appeared. The thing was that considering what dream force represented, it would of course appear more often. After all, anyone with an elevated sensory ability would have a small dream force affinity, whereas someone with a life force affinity would be much rarer. That said, the number of individuals who could use life and dream force to a high level were about the same. Meaning, the rarity still leveled out to equal in the end. To make the complex simple, the short of it was that everyone had a consciousness and many had a stronger consciousness after undergoing a metamorphosis. But, while everyone had life, not everyone had an elevated amount of it, and even less had such high affinity, but, somehow, the female still wasn't finished. Perfect grade 5 blood elemental affinity. Silence reigned as Aina removed her palm. Her expression didn't have any fluctuations upon hearing any of this. But, at that moment, there was a sudden burst of clapping. The issue was that it was only from one person. Lionel grinned and clapped enthusiastically, causing Aina to blush and glare at him. But, Lionel continued to clap as though he didn't notice. The female's gaze locked onto Aina, it never leaving. In fact, the gazes of the two males seemed to have awakened at that moment. From their lazy appearances, they stood up straight, their gazes burning. It wasn't Aina's numbers alone that shocked them so much, it was the numbers in combination with the curse chaining her. If that curse was lifted, on the outside Ri was pouting. He didn't cheer like that for Big Sis. Era smiled bitterly hearing Ri's words. She could tell that Ri didn't intend anyone else to hear these words, but with their strength, how could they miss it? Once again, City Lord Kiefer sent a questioning gaze toward Era, who could only try to dodge it. City Lord Kiefer really didn't know how to deal with this daughter-in-law of his. Traditionally speaking, he should be in a higher position in comparison. Yet, he felt as though he was on an equal playing level with this daughter-in-law of his. And, worst of all, he could subtly feel that she was lowering herself to allow him such ease of mind. In the end, he could only drop the topic once again. Within the tower, Lionel grinned as he watched Aina step down. Though she kept avoiding his gaze, he didn't mind. Others, though, found it hard to believe that the sword monstress was even capable of being embarrassed. Lionel stepped forward, hopping onto the elevated platform. Though the three figures all locked onto him, he didn't particularly care. He was happier with Aina's result than he would ever be with his own. The female didn't like Lionel very much. Who would like someone who aimed killing intent toward them? But, she still went ahead with the examination with her usual apathetic gaze. However, she would become frozen just the same. Morales? The female trembled. When she saw the list of affinities, her mind went blank. Lionel Morales. 19 years old. Quasi-grade 6 empty spear embryo. Inferior grade 6 complete bow embryo. Perfect grade 6 light elemental affinity. Perfect grade 6 variant earth affinity. Perfect grade 6 star elemental affinity. Quasi grade 7 fire elemental affinity. Perfect grade 9 dream elemental affinity. Chapter 390. Lionel removed his palm from the altar and sent a curious glance toward the female. Usually, she would have begun speaking by now. But, even after several moments, she had yet to. If the female knew that Lionel wanted her to hurry up, she might very well lash out in rage. At this very moment, her mind had become its own war zone. Under any other circumstances, finding such a genius was something she should be jumping around and celebrating. The kind of benefits she would receive from such a thing was endless, and that was just considering what she could gain from those old fogies. If she also considered what she could gain by simply having a connection with Lionel himself, the possibilities were endless. But that one name ruined everything. It made her tremble almost uncontrollably. Morales. Anared only had a shallow understanding of this family, but even he knew of their strength. Maybe the only reason he didn't treat Lionel any differently was because he didn't believe Lionel was a part of them. And, beyond that, even if Lionel activated his metal synergy lineage factor, Anared was ignorant enough to likely not even recognize it. But, for the female, it was as they said, the more powerful one became, the greater understanding and respect one had for those who were truly powerful. To have such a name and to also have a quasi-grade 6 empty spear embryo and a perfect grade 6 variant earth affinity. There couldn't possibly be such a coincidence in this world, right? This meant that Lionel was not only a member of that family, but he was one of the only 7 in the Nova generation to awaken both lineage factors. This was the only explanation. To put this matter into proper perspective, one had to understand how the grading system worked on a deeper level. There were 2 factors that decided one's grade, one's affinity and its comparison to one's dimensional level. However, this matter still wasn't so simple. One's talent could be considered a growth factor. Let's say for instance someone with average talent was noted as having a 1.0 growth factor while one with a greater talent would be considered a 2.0. Upon breaking through to the 4th dimension, the average talent strength would become 2.0 and the greater talent would become 4.0. Upon breaking through to the 5th, the former would become 3.0 and the latter would become 6.0. The disparity would only grow with time. And the harsh reality of it was that the separation was even more exaggerated than this and could be considered to be exponential. What was the point of all of this? It was to say that one with greater talent would experience more growth even while improving at the same rate. If this logic was applied to the grading system, it meant that the disparity between Lionel's dimensional level and his affinity would only grow with time, meaning that as he continued to improve, his grade would only continue to do so as well. For the females' organization, inferior grade 4 was considered average for new recruits. However, superior grade 4 already made you an elite amongst elites. To touch upon quasi-grade 5 within the 4th dimension was enough to make you an asset greatly worth fostering, while entering grade 5 firmly would make you among the few worthy of vying for a leadership position within the organization. The main issue here was that Lionel was still within the 3rd dimension. Yet, his worst talent was considered to be of the quasi-grade 6 level. And, his one talent that could be considered to be of the 4th dimension, his dream force, was perfect grade 9. This was all to say that these 3 were nowhere near equipped to deal with something like this. Take a potential heir of the Morales family as a new recruit? Was that a joke? Did they have a death wish? The longer the female remained silent, the more those around seemed to hang on her every word. None dared to look away for fear that they might miss something important. "Hello?" Lionel finally asked. It was a shame he hadn't been paying much attention before, or else maybe he would have been able to read the results himself. That said, he might have been overthinking things. It might not be so easy to read in the first place. The female snapped out from her thoughts and almost couldn't refrain from glaring at Lionel and gnashing her teeth. Was he having fun putting her in such a situation? "You know well what kind of family you come from, yet you came here to cause trouble. What for exactly? To chase women?" The female thought back to how Lionel treated Aina as though nothing else mattered in the world. But she couldn't bring herself to be too enraged. After all, the current Aina wasn't exactly considered a beauty. It would be much easier to believe that Lionel was just chasing skirts if this wasn't the case. "You." The female choked on her words before clearing her throat. "Aina Brazinger and Lionel Morales will skip the preliminary rounds. The rest of you new ones, prepare yourselves." A shocked murmur spread over the crowd. She didn't read out Lionel's grades, but she also said that Lionel could skip the preliminaries. According to what she said before, that meant that Lionel had at least one grade 5 affinity. But, if that was the case, why not read them aloud? Lionel raised an eyebrow but didn't say much more. Didn't skipping the preliminaries mean that he could chat idly with Aina for a while? As long as he got to do that, nothing else really mattered. Lionel stepped down from the platform to find Aina looking back at him with a hint of curiosity. It seems that she too wondered why it was that the female hadn't read his grades aloud like she had done with everyone else. They say curiosity is the first sign of falling in love. Lionel said to no one in particular. However, when Aina registered his words, her heart skipped a beat and her face went red. It was just a shame that much of it was marred by her inflamed scars. Lionel grinned. "Let's go to the side, Anne." Lionel's words paused. His gaze shifted to find Syl's elder brother, Anared, standing before him with a cold expression. Chapter 391. Is something the matter? Lionel asked. Lionel couldn't really understand why Anared had come here with such an aggressive stance. He couldn't remember offending Anared before. Yet, the latter was wearing an even colder expression than he usually did. "What do you mean by this exactly?" Anared replied coldly. "What the hell are you talking about?" Anared stared at Lionel for a long time. "It seems you want to die." Lionel's gaze grew cold. At that moment, Aina also reacted. A slight red light flickered within her almost golden irises. It seemed as though she might pull out her sword at any moment. "Big brother, what are you doing?" Syl's voice suddenly cut into the conversation. But Anared didn't respond to his sister. He looked from Lionel to Aina and back. "You'll leave her if you know what's good for you," Anared said coldly. Lionel suddenly took a step forward. There was nothing that could get him riled up quicker than matters related to Aina. In a single bound, he already stood less than a foot from Anared. With his height, he stared down from above, his gaze reflecting a slight violet hue. Anared's sword began to vibrate wildly to his back as though sensing a threat. But Anared didn't take a step back, his white robes billowing beneath Lionel's aura. "I don't know what story you've woven for yourself," Lionel began with an icy tone, "but I'd suggest you watch your words. The only reason I chose to join your Kiafur family's quota was to find her. I'm sure you're intelligent enough to understand what that means without me spelling it out for you." Lionel's meaning was clear. Why would he choose the Kiafur family over Aina? He would rather fall out with them at this very moment than give up on Aina. However, his words only enraged Anared more. Others took what Lionel said at face value, but all he heard was that Lionel toyed with his sister's emotions for the only purpose of finding another woman. And, now that he had found her, he couldn't be bothered to care about his sister anymore. Shing! 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 "Brother!" Sil all but screamed out. Anared frowned and looked toward his younger sister. You're embarrassing me. Step back. Anared was taken aback by his sister's words. This was the first time Sil had ever raised her voice toward him. Whether it was out of respect or fear, she never had. You misunderstood. Sil continued. It was sister-in-law that made it look as though we were involved. Lionel never made any advances on me. Anared's frown deepened. It doesn't matter. He must take responsibility regardless. Brother. I don't care. Anared continued coldly. Since he can use our Kiafur family, he should be able to take responsibility for it. Anared looked back toward Lionel. He was the only one that seemed to match Lionel's aura without taking a step back. In fact, his battle-intent soared as though he couldn't wait to cut Lionel down right where he stood. The red in Aina's eyes slowly faded as she seemed to catch an inkling of what was going on. Her eyes shifted toward Sil for a moment before looking away. Unfortunately, no one was in position to stop this face-off because the three leaders of this trial were having a heated debate of their own. What the hell's going on, Sale? One of the two men questioned. That kid's family name is Morales. The expressions of the two changed. The altar's abilities were mysterious and abstruse. It had the ability to delve into one's mind and find the truest form of address for a person. So, they had no doubt that whether he was a part of that family or not, Lionel's name truly was Morales. You sure it's not a case of a lower plane taking on a name they shouldn't? That happens all the time, Sale shook her head. He has a quasi-grade 6 empty spear embryo and a perfect grade 6 variant earth affinity. The two men were left speechless once again. At this point, Sale wanted to shed tears. Only she knew that this wasn't the end of it. The more she thought back to Lionel's list of talents, it made her want to ram her head into a wall. Was this the pain of comparing yourself to another? Complete bow embryo at 18 years old. What kind of nonsense is that? Then what should we do? The three fell into silence before one of the men stood. This is stupid. Why are we hiding away in a corner talking amongst ourselves? Isn't that man himself over there? Sale, you go talk to him and well handle these preliminary rounds. Maybe we're missing something important. The three of them hesitated. Usually, heirs like this were quite eccentric. What heir to a seventh-dimensional family would come down to the fourth dimension to chase an ugly woman? If this wasn't eccentric, then what was? Who knew? Maybe Lionel wanted to keep a low profile and would lash out at them if he was exposed. Knowing this, Sale couldn't help but glare toward the male who spoke. Since you were so confident, why don't you go? The male coughed. The fairer sex has a better chance of dealing with such things. Just look at the male's gaze shifted toward Sale's ample bosom, taking a gulp. How such a thin fabric held back such a bountiful harvest was beyond him. Yup, definitely, he wouldn't be able to bear doing anything to you, Sale's glare intensified. But, thinking of where they were and the image they were meant to project, she decided against slapping her colleague upside his head. Lionel Morales. A voice suddenly interrupted the heated stare down between Lionel and Anared. It hesitated for a moment before continuing. And Aina Brazinger. Come with me, please. Lionel's gaze didn't seem to want to leave Anared. But there was a strong tug at his robes that pulled him back. Aina all but dragged Lionel away. It seemed that her strength was still ridiculous. No, it had gotten even more ridiculous. All right, kids. Line up. Papa Ely is going to eliminate 90% of you. One of the two remaining men stepped up somewhat too enthusiastically. Chapter 392. Lionel gave Anared one more look before turning away and following Aina. He realized that he was even more sensitive about Aina compared to how he usually was. Of course, he somewhat understood why this was and inwardly kicked himself. The more he acted like this, the more subconscious Aina would be. He wasn't doing her any favors by being like this. If others heard Lionel's thoughts, they would realize that he seemed to be far more introspective about himself in relation to Aina than he was about himself alone. It was quite an interesting phenomenon, but Lionel, of course, wouldn't notice this. Sale led the two away. Somehow, likely through a teleportation pad, they disappeared and reappeared in a hidden room that oversaw the first floor. However, Lionel was certain that no one could see them as though they were standing behind a one-way viewing pan of glass. Once they reached this point, Lionel subtly put up his guard. This had long since become a habit of his. In truth, if he could have refused Sale's invite, he probably would have. Unfortunately, the environment only became more constrained over time because Sale didn't speak immediately. In fact, she seemed to be hesitating. After a while, she somewhat awkwardly puffed out her chest as though gathering her courage. "Be honest with me, why have you come here?" Sale looked right at Lionel, ignoring Aina. In truth, the only reason she had called Aina here was because she hoped that whatever feelings Lionel had for Aina would cause him to go easier on her. Lionel stood in confusion before he suddenly understood. "I know him from Earth, but I didn't hear anything about being unallowed to participate because of this." "Was I not allowed?" Sale froze. "From Earth? What was that supposed to mean?" "Wait, I think I've heard of Earth before. It's a new world the higher-ups are really invested in, but what does that have to do with this air? What kind of game is he playing here?" Aina stood aside, quite invested in Sale's answer as well. After all, she was from Earth too. The truth was that the reason she had a ticket to Terrain in the first place was because she heard about Brave City. It had to be remembered that the only reason Lionel would ever come to Terrain was because of Aina. And the only reason Aina was sent to Terrain by Lionel in the first place was because she had the ticket to begin with. If she couldn't join the organization behind Brave City, she would have to change all of her plans. "You really want to join us?" Sale was speechless. Lionel frowned. He really couldn't understand what Sale was getting at. In truth, he didn't want to join any organization. Every single one he had to this point had left a bad taste in his mouth. Plus, he had just rejected old Hutch's offer just a few months ago with the excuse that he didn't want to be under someone else's umbrella. If he joined another organization so quickly after this, he would feel a bit bad. That said, Lionel looked toward Aina. "You want to join them?" he asked. Aina blinked before nodding. Lionel smiled. "Then I do too." His reply was simple, but it held quite some sharpness to it. It was very obvious that he was only doing so for Aina, yet it also seemed this was enough to firm his resolve to an immovable degree. It sounded like even if Sale tried to reject him now, he would fight her to the death for standing in his way. Sale was stunned for a moment before her eyes glowed. Could it be about that? Of course, how could I not think of that? Sale looked away and began mumbling to herself like a madwoman. She nibbled at her red lips, lost in her own thoughts. If it really is about that, then this could either be a great opportunity or a catastrophe. I can't make this decision on my own. Forget it, when the time comes, this will have little to nothing to do with me, anyway. I might as well reap some benefits now and worry about the trouble that might come later. Sale took a deep breath. All right, here you both go. Aina and Lionel started as they caught two glistening pieces of metal out of the air. When they flipped over their palms, they found that these metal pieces were actually two rings. Lionel looked down in confusion. Spatial ring? What's this? These rings have everything you need to be officially inducted as one of our members. Our uniforms and your identification tokens are all in there. But, I should tell you that until you've gone to our headquarters with your tokens and have been properly registered, they are blank. So, make sure to keep them safe until the time comes. Lionel was stunned. He sent his senses into the ring and as expected, he found everything Sale spoke about. There were a pair of harem pants, a cloth that he assumed could work as the belt those three wore, and a heavy piece of neckwear also reminiscent of what those three wore. The only difference was that the belt cloth he received didn't have the embroidery those three had. In addition, his neckwear was a solid black that almost looked like unpolished iron. But, wasn't there supposed to be a long trial? He half expected that he would have to put his life on the line several times just to get an invite to this organization, all for them to piss him off for some reason or another in a few months to eventually force him to leave them. That seemed to be the story of his life to now. Struggling just to earn some more struggling. He had never been expected to so suddenly be handed what all those geniuses of terrain were fighting tooth and nail for. What the hell was going on? Chapter 393. Lionel was quite speechless for a long while. Aina looked down at the ring in her hand before looking toward Lionel's side profile. Though she could sense how surprised Lionel was as well, she also felt that this had to do more with him than her. It left her feeling quite curious. But, when she suddenly remembered Lionel's words from earlier, she blushed and looked away as though unwilling to acknowledge the fact that she had been curious in the first place. Oh right, I also forgot to mention the last thing. The ring also asks as a life-saving treasure, but it won't be activated quite yet. The first time it will activate is when the recruitment process is over. When that happens, the ring will glow. Once it begins to glow, you have a day to prepare. Within that day, you can activate the ring at any time and be transported directly to our core world. That's the place you will register. After the registration process is over, the ring will be able to function normally. As long as it's charged, or depending on the level to which it has been charged, it can teleport its wearer to either a random location within range or to a set location. Lionel was still quite absent-minded during this explanation, but he understood the gist of it. Regardless, for now, the abilities of the ring were useless to him until the registration process ended. Only then would it activate and begin to work normally. Is there no set date for the registration process to be over? Aina asked. About this. Sale sounded somewhat embarrassed. I will be honest. Normally, a place like Terrain wouldn't even be worthy of gaining one of our recruitment stations. But, we've been forced to widen our net recently due to various circumstances. It's much easier on us if we bring everyone in at once, the cost is much less. So, until we meet a certain number of new recruits, we won't activate the formation. It will probably take between 1 to 3 years before the next mass teleportation. Sale coughed slightly and looked toward Lionel. It was only after seeing that Lionel didn't react much to this that she sighed a breath of relief. It seems that he cares more about this Aina's opinion than anything else. I should tell the higher-ups to focus on pleasing her, then, oh. Lionel's eyes suddenly brightened. Can you help me get rid of this thing? There must be certain privileges in being one of your members, right? Sale was stunned for a moment. When she focused on Lionel's forehead, she finally noticed the monitoring brand hidden slightly behind his Emperor brand. When she realized what Lionel was talking about, her expression became a bit weird. They dared to mark a member of the Morales family? They overestimated themselves a bit too much, didn't they? If one of those behemoths became enraged, who would take responsibility for it, exactly? Sale shook her head. He probably got into a bit of trouble. But, it makes sense he couldn't get rid of the brand, he's still a bit too weak to do that. Lionel was right. Even members of the organization behind Brave City couldn't be so casually branded without adequate reason, let alone a member of the Morales family. But, Sale seemed to understand that Lionel was hiding himself away, likely to appear humble before Aina and not try to flaunt his status. So, she simply nodded and her force surged. Regardless, since he was practically one of them now, it shouldn't be a problem. Since they only monitored Lionel to begin with, it shouldn't be a matter of life and death anyway. Lionel's pupils constricted when he felt Sale's strength. He was truly shocked for a while. In the blink of an eye, Lionel felt invisible shackles that had been around him shatter. Lionel suddenly felt much lighter and better than he had in a very long time. He took a deep breath. It felt as though all the force in the surroundings surged toward him as he smiled brightly. Thank you. This had been a looming darkness over Lionel for a long while. He suddenly felt much freer. Aina watched to the side with a puzzled expression. She wasn't sure what the monitoring brand meant. She also wondered how Lionel managed to get into more trouble than she did. Aina had quite literally slaughtered her way out of cities and hadn't ended up with such a brand. It could only be said that Lionel was truly unlucky. Lionel smiled cheerfully. I only have one more request. Can you help us leave this place secretly? Not long later, Lionel and Aina walked side by side out of Brave City. So many were focused on the proceedings that no one would notice until the preliminaries ended that two of the participants had disappeared. But, by then, several days would have passed. Do you have any plans until the ring activates? Lionel asked Aina, his smile never leaving his face. Aina shook her head lightly. Her main goal had been to join this organization. Now that she planned to just wait patiently. Even if she did so on terrain, it was unlikely anyone would bother her. After all, the status the two of them now had was quite high. Return to Earth with me. Aina's steps paused for a moment. Her heart was a bit hesitant. Not only did she not like Earth very much, she also didn't know how she felt about getting so close to Lionel again after she had just resolved herself not to. Though she now knew that Lionel could hold his own and that maybe his background wasn't so simple, this had never been the reason she tried to build a wall between them in the first place. But, before she even went through a logical progression, she still found her head involuntarily nodding before she quickly shifted to shaking it. I just broke into the fourth dimension. I can't return to Earth by normal means. After saying this, she sighed a breath of relief. Yes, this was a very good reason. Hearing this, Lionel was slightly disappointed. He needed to return to Earth to deal with the Royal Blue Fort. He couldn't allow things to just continue like that without stepping in. He was still worried about what might be happening to his teammates. Lionel looked down at his ring and slipped it onto his finger, walking aimlessly forward. He couldn't just ignore the lives of his teammates just to follow beside Aina. There was a limit to how much he could place her as his first priority. Suddenly, Lionel froze. He looked down at his ring. He remembered, when he looked inside of it, its space was much larger than his spatial bracelet. When Lionel came to terrain, he noticed that his bracelet went from having a 2 cubic meter space to 1. But, this spatial ring had a 10 cubic meter space. The segmented cube should be able to fit inside of it even if there's a human inside. Lionel's eyes glowed and he explained his idea to Aina. How about it? Lionel looked toward Aina expectantly. Aina's heart trembled beneath Lionel's gaze. For some reason, she couldn't bring herself to say no. In fact, she felt somewhat warm inside. A treasure that could house a person? Just what level of secret was that? But, Lionel didn't even hesitate to divulge it. Looking down toward the ground, her head nodded ever so slightly. Even with Lionel's senses, he almost missed it. But, when he confirmed what he had seen, his grin took up half his face. Okay, let's go. We can pay them back for putting us in this mess to begin with. Lionel had no idea that while he was feeling the happiest, Shield Cross Stars had noticed the disappearance of his marking brand. Chapter 394. What happened? How is that possible? Finn abruptly stood, almost knocking his office table over. During the past several months, he and Thorn had been racking their brains, trying to figure out a way to pin Lionel into a corner. However, the longer they observed Lionel for, the more troublesome this matter seemed to become. By some magic, the refugee they had singled out suddenly became a vassal of the Kiafur family and even entered Brave City. Though their organization wasn't necessarily afraid of the powers behind Brave City, Scythe's hidden meaning during his talk with them already made it clear that they couldn't so boldly use the strength of Shield Cross Stars. On top of this, even if they had the freedom to do as much, entering Brave City during the first phase would enrage all the powers of terrain, and entering during the second phase was all the more impossible. When they learned that Lionel had done this, they realized that their only chance was to wait for him to leave and then set a trap for him. The truth was that they didn't consider a possibility of Lionel being accepted as a member of this organization at all. After all, in the history of terrain, no one had ever managed to pass over the final hurdle. And those who had the best chance were on their second and final attempts, like Syl's elder brother and the other heirs. They thought that even if Lionel was talented, he would at least need a second attempt. But, with their influence, he likely wouldn't even live to see it. Unfortunately, just as they had calmed themselves with this narrative, Lionel's monitoring brand vanished. "Someone find out for me as quickly as possible what happened in Brave City," Finn barked. Due to Scythe's warning, Finn and Thorn didn't dare to get too close to the situation. As a result, they didn't even dare to personally monitor the situation of the third phase. Even sending someone to scout the situation was risky, but at this point, they no longer had a choice. Thorn met Finn's gaze from across the room, both of them holding a complex look on their visages. In order to get rid of that brand, someone exceptionally powerful within the fourth dimension or someone of the fifth dimension, in the very least, would have had to act. There shouldn't be anyone powerful enough on terrain to accomplish this feat. If there was, they were all old recluses that didn't casually travel out. This meant that the likeliest explanation was that Lionel had gotten help from those behind Brave City. And, if that was the case, that made things much more complicated. Under normal circumstances, this wasn't a big deal. There was no need for that organization to communicate with them before freeing one of their own from monitoring. Since they hadn't labeled Lionel with having committed any egregious crimes, they were perfectly in the right. Suddenly, their hope of keeping these matters low profile had come back to bite them. Hours later, Finn and Thorn received the report they were waiting for, only to read it silently with ever-increasingly ugly expressions. Thinking back to their disdainful dismissal of Lionel, especially in the case of Finn, who sneered as Lionel was forced to sign his name, their jaws clenched. The two looked at one another. They knew they had no choice but to bring this to Scythe. Scythe read the report Finn and Thorn brought him silently. But this very silence felt like a mountain weighing heavily on their chests. The longer Scythe remained like this, the greater this pressure grew. A long while later, Scythe placed the documents down. "Have you two noticed anything interesting about this world?" Finn and Thorn looked toward one another, confused about the question. Wasn't this supposed to be about Lionel? Why were they suddenly talking about terrain? "Please enlighten us, Commander Scythe." Scythe's head tilted slightly as he observed the two before him. It didn't seem like a normal human quirk at all. When his pale skin and sunken eyes were taken into account, he looked like a predator watching his prey. His black eyes darted between their vital points as though always calculating the fastest way to kill them. The feeling was like a coldness seeping into their veins. "If you two really have no idea, I would be greatly disappointed." Finn and Thorn shivered, their teeth chattering. For some reason, it felt as though the temperature in the room had plummeted. "Tell me, why is it that you detained this Lionel Morales in the first place?" We detained him because of a tip given by a teleportation station attendee. Our organization's motto is to be a shield across the stars, but in order to do so we need to work together with the local governments. The officials of terrain were worried about the sudden activity of a few fugitives, so we began to monitor anyone who looked suspicious. Thorn explained quickly. In fact, her response was so textbook that she forgot to take out things that Scythe obviously knew already. But, it just went to show just how nervous she was feeling. Scythe looked back toward the documents on his desk casually. But, his subtle action took a world of pressure off of the two of them. Until he spoke his next words, that is. "Work together with the local government, huh? For a small fee, though, is that right?" Thorn and Finn froze, beads of sweat pouring down their faces and backs. All the words they wanted to speak got lodged in their throats, unable to form into proper sentences. Some corruption is inevitable in such a large organization. In fact, I would argue that it's necessary in many cases. But that doesn't give you license to be stupid. Such a big secret is looming over your heads and you don't even realize that you're being used to keep it as such. Disappointing. Truly disappointing. Saga closed the documents once more and stood. By this point, Finn and Thorn were trembling uncontrollably. It felt as though there was only a thin string dangling from the tops of their heads to the ceilings above, stopping them from collapsing to their knees. There's no point in explaining these things to you. Since you haven't understood it by now, it will only be a waste of my time. Saga crossed his arms to his back and looked out toward the blank wall. His actions seemed to be out of habit, but the fact there was no view to see made it all seem somewhat odd. However, with the amount of fear the two officers were feeling, they didn't even pick up on this detail at all. The recruitment process of Valiant Heart Mountain won't finish for another 1 to 3 years. By then, there will be plenty of chances to complete what needs to be done. I'll have you two complete some preparations. I only hope you don't disappoint me again. Hearing these words, the two could no longer stand it and collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as Saga strolled out from the hidden underground room. Chapter 395. Lionel was shocked by how easy it was for him to return to Earth. He had been looking over his shoulder the whole way, yet not only did no one stop him, but the experience was surprisingly pleasant. Compared to what he experienced when he was branded like a slave, the difference was like night and day. He easily found the closest city by following the roads and avoiding danger using his vastly improved internal strength. Then, after paying a hefty fee, he was able to buy a ticket to use a teleportation platform. Lionel didn't have herb coins, but he did have a large amount of herb Oregon. This was what he relied on to constantly refine his body toward the perfection stage. Thankfully, the process of trading in herb ores for herb coins was exceptionally easy. There were a few government trade posts he could find within any city. Lionel was a bit surprised to find that herb ore was actually more valuable than herb coins. But, after some thought, this made sense. Herb coins were usually only used by low-level worlds to make things convenient for their weaker citizens. In higher-level worlds, and especially in high-profile markets, auctions and the like, most trades were completed with unrefined herb ores. In these cases, rather than using individual coins, the denominations were in kilograms of herb Oregon. Thankfully, in regards to those of third and fourth dimensional worlds, Lionel was considered semi-wealthy. So, buying a single ticket to Earth wasn't a problem and also didn't even make much of a dent into his financial situation. If anything, refining his metal body was by far the largest expenditure. At Lionel's current level, even absorbing 10 kilograms worth of herb essence hardly budged the needle anymore. It seemed that reaching the perfection stage wasn't as easy as he thought it would be. Lionel wondered if he should try and trade up to bronze-grade herb or to try and make a final breakthrough. But, in the end, he decided against it. His recklessness had already almost killed him once this year. He didn't want to give the fates a chance to take him to the next world again. Not so soon after the last time, anyway. Of course, if others heard Lionel's thoughts, they would think he was a madman. If he really thought he had only tempted fate just once, he was crazier than even he knew. Lionel disappeared into the teleportation formation with no one realizing that he was a wanted criminal. The process for leaving a world was obviously much less involved than coming to it. Whatever problems he posed would be the issue of that world to deal with. Unfortunately, Lionel's good mood didn't last very long. He had forgotten one very important thing in all his excitement. Earth didn't have any teleportation pads. When Lionel appeared, he blankly stared at his surroundings. Wild winds whipped around him, black clouds rumbled above, thunderous booms and crackling lightning shook the skies. He was falling from the skies. Lionel hardly reacted. He simply looked toward the black ocean waters he was hurtling toward at inconceivable speeds. This was the look of a defeated man. A man who was so used to his bad luck by now that he could only sigh. What were the odds that he would appear in the skies above the ocean? If Lionel thought about it, the likelihood was actually quite high. After all, 70% of Earth was nothing but vast waters. But it probably wasn't the smartest thing to do to tell a man down on his luck that his situation made sense. Luckily, Lionel reached out toward his spatial ring with a thought. In the blink of an eye, a black object appeared beneath his feet like a floating surfboard. Lionel smiled wildly. He had been waiting for an opportunity to use this treasure. Unfortunately, he didn't dare to use it on terrain for fear that he would be the subject of someone's greed. After all, this treasure was of the SSS grade and happened to be the ride Lionel had asked Uncle Montez for. The treasure had 2 modes, but both were only built for a single person to use. The surf mode, which Lionel was currently in, had the greatest degree of freedom for movement. It was nimble and shifty, but it sacrificed top-line speed in return. The second mode, Lionel poured his force into the surfboard as his fall slowed to a floating hover. Soon, the black board shifted, becoming a one-person shuttle. Lionel sat down, reaching out his hands and grabbing onto a butterfly steering wheel. Even if he wanted to, he didn't think he'd be able to stop the grin from spreading across his face. The shuttle mode was where the real speed lay. It took a minimal amount of force to output tremendous speed. If Lionel used normal force, he could probably round Earth in 6 hours at most. If he used light elemental force, that time plummeted to half of that. Of course, the shuttle lost nimbleness as a result. But, in return it was blazingly fast. Lionel pressed down on the pedal. The instant he did, a strong G-force tried to rip him apart, but his smile didn't fade. With the strength of his body, he could still handle it. A black-gold light streaked across Earth's water as the laughter of a teenage boy sounded beneath the rumbling clouds. Lionel easily made it to Earth's main continent. Aside from being a transportation vehicle, the shuttle could project a rough map of the world. Though it didn't have anything as detailed as city locations, it had enough about the geography. With Lionel's education, the geography was all he needed to find his way back to Royal Blue Province in just over an hour. In fact, he was a bit disappointed that the trip was so short. Lionel found a secluded region away from invalids. Due to the speed of the shuttle, any that sensed the force he used to propel his shuttle had long since been left behind, but he was still cautious. After burying himself deep underground, Lionel entered the segmented cube. Aina? Lionel didn't find Aina where he thought he would. But, his sharp senses soon caught the sound of moving water. She's in the bathhouse? Lionel's heart skipped a beat. Chapter 396. Lionel willed himself to calm down and he entered his own room, leaving Aina to herself. Now that he thought about it, he really had left her alone for quite a while. It made sense that she would find something to do. Who knew when the last time she had a time to relax was? Lionel couldn't help but smile. Back in the Joan zone, Aina never needed to bathe due to her military-type uniform. Its self-cleaning function made sure she wouldn't need to worry about it. So, this was the first time Lionel had experienced this sort of feeling. What started as him forcefully suppressing the lewd thoughts of a young man became him appreciating the sound of the moving water in a silent but sweet peace. It had become less about the fact Aina was washing herself and more about that she trusted him enough to do so. Maybe he was just overthinking it. There was always a chance that he was. But, the thought still brought him peace of mind. Oh. You're back, I hope you don't mind Aina's voice woke Lionel from his odd peaceful state. He looked up toward her and smiled. The slight embarrassment on Aina's face made his smile somewhat brighter. He could see that she hadn't really thought about it before choosing to bathe here. Knowing Aina, if she had thought it through, she wouldn't feel embarrassed in the slightest. That realization only made him happier. It was like an unconditional trust even she wasn't aware she had for him. Lionel's brows raised as he stood from his bed and walked to the door he had left open. The swelling, it's gone down. Were the waters helpful to you? Lionel realized this immediately. Before, the swelling and inflammation of Aina's scars was quite bad. It was to the point that it seemed they might burst with a foul liquid at any moment. In fact, he could hardly see the features of her real face because of this. What Lionel didn't know was that this always happened after Aina used the effect of the curse to help her training. The impact was even more exaggerated after she ingested the fifth-dimensional abyss panther blood. Usually, it would take months for the swelling to eventually die down. But, this time, it didn't seem to want to go away at all and left her in a perpetual state of pain and itchiness. Surprisingly, though, the cleansing waters of the segmented cube's abode setting quelled this swelling almost immediately. Aina lowered her head, avoiding Lionel's gaze. Lionel didn't mind this much at all. In fact, he was even happier that he could be of help. All of the water in the segmented cube comes out as cleansing waters. Take as much as you want to bathe or drink. Aina's eyes widened. I can't do that, it's too valuable. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Is it? This abode seems to make an endless supply of it. Aina was speechless toward Lionel's ignorance. She looked up with a glare Lionel was familiar with seeing. Usually, she only used this look when she was reprimanding him. Cleansing waters are incredibly rare. It can only be produced by a person with a very special innate water force node. Even for such a person, it's a hard task to form even a single cup of it. Other than that, it can only be produced naturally at the convergence of 7 purities. Lionel blinked, not really understanding what much of that meant, especially the 7 purities part. All he knew was that he used this water for everything from taking a bath to brushing his teeth to drinking a glass of water. In fact, though he didn't check for obvious reasons, he was pretty sure his toilet water was made of it too. Lionel waved a hand. Never mind that. Seriously, take as much as you want. There's no need to suffer in silence when I'm here. Aina's glare became somewhat vacant for a moment as though she was shocked to hear such words. She stared blankly at Lionel, getting lost in her thoughts for a moment. Lionel met her gaze as though trying to convey his meaning and determination through his eyes. After the swelling lessened, Lionel could see the true structure of Aina's face. He burned the image into his mind, not only because he was infatuated with her looks, but because this was the first time he was truly seeing the real her. This was the woman, in all his madness, that he had sworn to hitch his life to. Maybe to this day he still didn't know the exact reason. But, didn't they say that in this new world the future could influence the past? Lionel liked to believe that maybe he was less crazy than many believed and that an undying devotion his future self felt was what drove him now. However, this only gave Lionel motivation. What shook him to his core was maybe if it wasn't a future love that caused his current feelings, but a future regret. What if he lost Aina in the future? What if the feelings of hurt, anger, and helplessness were so powerful that they pierced through the veil of reality and returned to his younger self, driving him to not repeat the same mistake again? This was probably the first time Lionel even admitted these things to himself, but something was screaming to him that it wasn't just love that drove him to this level of madness. He had said it himself before, hate drove far more than love did. Negativity fueled more than positivity, evil disseminated far more than good. For Lionel to feel this way, he knew that it wasn't a simple matter of love. Lionel reached a hand toward Aina's face. The action shook her from her stupor. Her body involuntarily trembled as though wanting to take a step back. But, for some odd reason, her feet seemed rooted in place. Lionel smiled a somewhat sad smile. It carried a weight that was far beyond his years and an emotion that was far more complex than he was willing to feel. Seeing it, Aina felt as though she too had been thrust into an all-new world, one she also wasn't quite ready for. Lionel's hand brushed by Aina's face and touched her flowing black hair. A slight rush of force surrounded the two, and Aina, who had become completely lost in Lionel's smile, barely registered the fact the air had grown much hotter all of a sudden. In the blink of an eye, Aina's wet hair became dry and Lionel retracted his hand. Wouldn't want you to catch a cold, right? Lionel grinned, his normal childish look returning. Whatever weight his gaze once held vanished, making Aina's knees feel somewhat weak. Out of her control, she fell forward only to be stopped by Lionel's broad chest. Lionel was stunned for a moment, but he didn't let her escape like she wanted to. His arms wrapped around her back, enveloping her small frame. Aina froze for a long while. But in the end, her small hands gripped the sides of Lionel's shirt. A peaceful silence took hold of the segmented cube. As the clouds continued to rumble and Earth seemed to become ever more chaotic, the two seemed oblivious. Chapter 397. Lionel almost couldn't refrain from laughing as he watched Aina run away like a frightened rabbit. Even a while after she had disappeared into the room she chose, he could still feel the softness of her frame. Behind the closed door, Aina slipped down to the floor, her face a beet shade of red. Her heart beat wildly and completely out of her control. It made her breathing seem somewhat erratic and anxious. The last time she had been so intimate with Lionel, her legs had been blown off. So, it was safe to say that she wasn't really thinking about how embarrassed she should or shouldn't have been. But this time, there wasn't such a looming elephant in the room. It was almost too much for her to bear. It was only a long while later that Aina's heart finally calmed. Ironically, it was because she could hear the same moving waters Lionel had just moments ago. Just listening to them made her feel the same peace Lionel had. Aina reached a hand toward one of her military pockets and pulled out a cracked bracelet. It was quite funny. Considering all the treasures she had, a mere C-grade defensive treasure was practically useless garbage. But, other than her axe, this had been one of the only things she managed to hold on to in her injured state back then. She looked at the bracelet until the sudden end to the rushing waters woke her up. She quickly put it away, the hazy look in her eyes clearing. At that moment, a knock came from her door. Unsurprisingly, it was Lionel. He was the only other one in the abode setting to begin with. But, what Aina hadn't expected was that when she opened the door a black blur would suddenly pounce at her. Her first instinct was to reach for her axe, but she instantly realized that she had taken it off her back. She felt safe in this place so she wasn't constantly on her guard. It wasn't long after that she realized that even if her axe had been on her back, she wouldn't have been able to get to it in time. This black blur was simply too fast. A strong force collided with Aina's chest, causing her to take a step back. But, when she looked down, she found an adorable little mink using its small claws to latch onto a few of her countless pockets. Little Blackstar, seemingly feeling a familiar intimacy with Aina through his connection with Lionel, treated her like a playmate too. Unfortunately, though Aina was stronger physically than Lionel, her Buddhist defenses were far weaker. So, what would be a playful nudge to Lionel almost knocked Aina's breath away. "Little Blackstar," Lionel reprimanded. There wasn't much he could do about the little mink. The little guy was simply too fast. It also didn't help that Blackstar treated Lionel like his pet rather than the other way around. This left Lionel feeling somewhat helpless. Aina took a deep breath to recover before looking down at the little mink. A light smile played her features as she slowly reached a hand forward to pat Blackstar's small little head. "This is your beast partner?" Aina asked. "Emicham," Lionel nodded. "The little guy is pretty powerful but is too playful. I thought that he was growing more mature because he started to take more naps recently, but now he's back to his usual antics." Aina blinked curiously, gathering the adorable little mink in her arms. Blackstar seemed to quickly realize that compared to around Lionel's neck and the top of his head, Aina's chest was the much more comfortable place to be. It wasn't long before the little guy showed no intention of returning. "How did you manage to contract him?" "Well..." Lionel scratched his head somewhat awkwardly. After some hesitation, he finally told the truth. "Shoo!" Aina couldn't refrain from laughing, her light giggle tickling Lionel's eardrums. Hey. Is there a need to laugh so hard? We share a relationship of equals," Lionel said defiantly. Emicham. Aina nodded but continued to play with the little mink, a happy smile on her face. Lionel sighed as he watched this scene. It seemed that not only did he lose his beast partner to Aina's chest, he lost Aina to the little mink. Life truly wasn't fair. The next few moments between the two were quite peaceful. Within the dining area of the abode setting, Lionel brought out some of the foods he had bought before leaving Terrain. However, Lionel was shocked to find that Aina didn't only match him in how much she ate, but she even somewhat surpassed him. Lionel had spent months within a zone with Aina, but he hadn't noticed this before at all. After a while of thought, though, he understood. And when he did, he felt somewhat bad. In the Joan zone, he and Aina had always hunted for their own food. Since he was the long-ranged attacker amongst the two of them, it obviously fell onto his shoulders. But, he always only captured one beast. He would always take most of the beast and leave behind what he thought would fulfill Aina's appetite, not realizing that he was underfeeding her at all. This time, however, because he was curious about Terrain's cuisine, after all, this was the first time he was tasting another world's food, he had brought back way too much, thinking he could just store whatever was left within one of the snow globes to preserve it until next time. However, what he had never thought of was the possibility that between the two of them, clearing out such a large amount of food was a simple task. Learning this about Aina didn't make Lionel like her any less. In fact, he felt happy once again because he was learning more and more about her the longer he spent with her. He didn't apologize for his mistakes in the past, he just etched this into his mind. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. At the same time, he made a mental note to be more observant in the future. For whatever reason, Aina didn't seem to like to divulge such things openly. It would be up to him to decode this beauty. Aina looked up with a cute and innocent look in her eye. But, contrasted with the massive beast leg she held in her hand, Lionel couldn't help but smile at the adorable image. Though the beast leg was larger than half Aina's body, Lionel was certain that it would probably only take Aina half an hour at most to wipe it clean. Lionel shook his head. "We should talk about the fort and how to approach it," Lionel said. Aina paused mid-bite. The truth was that she too wanted to take down Royal Blue Fort, she also had friends within. But, they had to think of the normal citizens as well. If things devolved the way it did last time, they would be doing more harm than good. So, how should they do things this time? You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.